They say a king can survive a war, a famine, even a plague. But there is one wound that no crown can shield against. The moment the person you were born to love looks through you like you are furniture, like you are nothing, like the bond the universe stitched between your souls was just an inconvenience on their calendar. Tonight, we're talking about what happens when an alpha doesn't break, when she walks away, and when she comes back, not for love, for reckoning. Stay until the end. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Because this story belongs to every one of you who ever refused to beg. The banquet hall of Moonfang Palace had been built to remind people of their smallness. Whoever the architect had been, some forgotten genius 2 centuries dead, they understood the psychology of power better than any general who ever drew blood on a battlefield. The ceilings soared 40 feet above the marble floor, ribbed with obsidian beams carved into the shapes of wolves mid-leap, their stone jaws frozen in permanent conquest. Chandeliers descended from those heights on chains as thick as a man's forearm, each one a cascade of crystal pulled from glacial caves in the far north, shaped into interlocking bones, lit from within by a cold luminescence that made every face in the room look like it belonged to the dead. The walls bore murals of the Thorn dynasty's victories, every one of them painted in blood pigment. The court historian had confirmed it once, drunk on aged mead and proud of the detail, and no one who heard him had been surprised. Power in Veilor did not whisper. It declared. Celine Veyer stood near the eastern pillar, third from the rear, in the position she had occupied at every formal gathering for the past 4 years. Not seated at the long obsidian tables where noble bloodlines arranged themselves by rank and recent favor. Not among the serving staff who moved in practiced invisibility along the outer corridors. Somewhere between. In the space that had no official name because the palace had never needed a word for someone like her. She wore gray. She always wore gray at these events, an instinctive camouflage she had developed without ever consciously deciding to, the way prey animals learn coloration before they understand they are being hunted. She was 23 years old and had lived inside this palace since she was 9. In that time, she had learned 3 things more completely than she had ever learned anything else. How to listen without appearing to, how to move without being tracked, and how to survive proximity to Darius Thorn without letting the mate bond reduce her to something she couldn't respect. That last one had taken the longest. The Winter Ascension banquet arrived every year at the turn of the frozen season, when the Empire officially acknowledged that another cycle of conquest had concluded and another year of order, Veilor's particular, brutal version of order, would begin. Lords traveled from provinces 3 weeks distant. Ladies brought dowries of political intelligence wrapped in silk and perfume. Merchants secured their positions near minor nobles, the way gamblers secured their bets near someone on a winning streak. The palace filled with ambition and old money and the specific acrid tension of people who smiled at each other while calculating angles of ruin. And every year, Darius Thorn sat on the obsidian throne at the head of the hall and made the room remember why it feared him. He was 31. Built the way old wars built men. Not for aesthetics, but for function, for endurance, for the kind of sustained violence that required both physical mass and a mind that never stopped calculating. His shoulders carried the breadth of someone who had fought in hand-to-hand campaigns before his generals thought he should be allowed near a real battlefield. His jaw carried a scar from a border skirmish in his 22nd year that he had never bothered to have treated properly, a pale ridge from ear to chin that his court had learned not to comment on. He wore his dark hair close-cropped, no ornamentation, no rings or chains or the decorative pelts that lesser alpha lords layered on themselves to project dominance they hadn't actually earned. He didn't need decoration. The room compressed when he entered it, not metaphorically. People physically redistributed themselves, unconsciously orienting toward him or unconsciously giving ground, like iron filings around a magnet they couldn't see. Celine had watched it happen for 4 years, and it still unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, because it was the same pull she felt. But she had learned, at tremendous cost to something essential inside her, to feel it and not move. The mate bond had announced itself 18 months ago. She had recognized it immediately. Every alpha bloodline carried the knowledge of it the way they carried the knowledge of language, buried in instinct long before the mind could name it. a specific gravity, a tectonic certainty. The sense that the universe had made a structural decision about the architecture of your future and was now waiting, with the patience of something very old and very indifferent to your comfort, for you to acknowledge the fact. She had not told him. She had watched him instead, observed the way his eyes sometimes found her in corridors before his attention corrected itself and moved on, the way certain meetings ran differently when she was in the room carrying messages, a subtle shift in the temperature of his focus, there and then gone, like a flame someone cupped their hand around in wind. She told herself she was being careful, being smart. An orphan with no bloodline and no title and no protection did not walk up to the King Alpha of Valor and announce that fate had matched them. She told herself that every day for 18 months. And then the Winter Ascension banquet arrived, and someone else told him first. She didn't know who. She never found out. What she knew was that midway through the second course, a shift moved through the hall. Not visible. Atmospheric. The way pressure changes before a storm when there is still no cloud in the sky. She felt it in her sternum before she understood it, a new quality in the air, and when her eyes moved to the throne automatically. Because her eyes always moved to the throne when something changed in the room. 4 years of survival instinct. She found Darius already looking at her. Not the correcting look. Not the look that moved on. A look that stayed. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Lady Seraphine Morvain appeared at his right, silver silk and generations of political architecture, and a smile that had been engineered for exactly this kind of room, and she said something close to his ear with her hand resting on the obsidian armor rest an inch from his, and the 4 seconds ended. Celine looked away first. Her hands, clasped at her waist in the posture she maintained at formal events, were perfectly still. The food arrived in courses wrapped in ceremony. Speeches were delivered. Alliances were implied through seating arrangements and refuted through wine choices. The orchestrated theater of Valor's nobility performed itself with the efficiency of something that had been rehearsed so many times it had stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like nature. Celine stood near the eastern pillar and did not eat and did not speak, and catalogued the room the way she always did, tracking the movements of people whose movements mattered, filing information in the architecture of her memory where she had built, over years, something that functioned like a map of the Empire's actual power beneath its official one. She was doing this when the hall went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a speech beginning, the wrong quiet. The kind that spreads from a center outward, like ripples from something heavy dropped into still water. Darius had risen from the obsidian throne. This was unusual. He did not stand during banquets except at the formal opening and closing, and neither of those moments had arrived. The lords and ladies registered this deviation with the particular alertness of people who had learned to read the king's body language as a survival skill. Forks paused. Goblets lowered. 40 conversations tapered into silence within the span of 6 heartbeats. He was looking at her again, and this time the entire room followed his gaze. Selena felt it before she processed it. The weight of combined attention was a physical sensation she knew well from 4 years of existing in the margins of power, but this was different in quality. Not the glancing attention of people registering that a courier stood near a pillar. This was concentrated, directed. The full focus of Valor's most powerful bloodlines converged on a woman in gray standing alone against the wall. Her heartbeat did not change. That was the thing she would remember later, in the cold and the dark, and the weeks it took to reach the ashen frontier. Her heartbeat did not change. Some part of her had already understood, had already read the atmosphere of the room and the quality of Darius's expression, and the particular angle of Seraphine Morvain's satisfaction, and assembled the information into a conclusion she was not yet consciously willing to hold. Darius spoke. His voice carried in that hall the way it always did, without effort, without performance, with the particular resonance of someone who had never in his adult life needed to raise it to be heard. "There are those," he said, "who mistake proximity to power for a claim upon it." The silence deepened. Celine breathed. "There are those who mistake a bond of instinct, an accident of blood, for an invitation into legacy." He paused, not for effect. He had never needed effect. He paused the way a man pauses when he is being precise, choosing words with the care of someone who understood that words from a throne were irreversible. Valor does not honor accidents. Valor honors bloodlines, lineage, merit forged through service to the empire. Another pause. The room held its breath as one organism. She means nothing. The crystal chandeliers above seemed colder. She means nothing. 3 words. She had carried heavier objects than 3 words. She had survived colder temperatures than the temperature of a throne room after a public dismissal. She had endured sharper humiliations in quieter corridors with no witnesses and no memory except her own. But the mind does something particular when it receives a wound it has long anticipated and specifically dreaded. It does not protect. It does not numb. It simply presents the wound in full clarity. Every edge of it, the way a light held close to a cut, shows every fiber of tissue that has been separated from what it was attached to. She means nothing. A lord near the second table coughed. Someone's goblet touched marble with a sound that rang through the hall like a small bell. Seraphine Morvain's expression was a masterwork of controlled satisfaction, the face of someone who had spent considerable resources engineering this precise moment and was now watching it execute. And Darius Thorne sat back down on the obsidian throne and returned his attention to the room as if the matter was concluded, as if he had ruled on a minor dispute, as if the mate bond was an administrative issue that had been resolved, as if she was not standing 12 feet from him with the full weight of Valor's nobility, watching her decide what she would do next. She means nothing. Celine unclenched her hands. She had not been aware she'd clenched them. The room was still watching, not with cruelty. Most of these people were beyond cruelty as an emotion. They had refined it into strategy long ago. But with the calculating attention of people witnessing a social execution and assessing the aftermath for opportunity. The lords near the high tables were already running calculations. The ladies were already composing the versions of this story they would carry back to their provinces. A mate bond publicly rejected. A woman with no bloodline and no title standing alone in a crowd of people whose interest in her had lasted exactly as long as her potential threat to their arrangements. Now she was not a threat. She was a lesson, and lessons were only useful for the brief moment before they were forgotten. Celine did something that no one in that hall expected. She bowed. Not a bow of humiliation, not a bow of submission or of someone collapsing inward from shame. A bow with the precise, measured depth of someone who understood protocol and was demonstrating that she did. The bow of a person who had been in this palace long enough to know every form and who was choosing, in this moment, to use the correct one. Then she turned and walked toward the hall's eastern exit. Not quickly, not slowly. At the same pace she always walked, the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and was not afraid of the distance between here and there. Behind her, the room held its fractured silence for 3 more seconds. Then the conversations resumed. She means nothing, already becoming anecdote. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of it until she reached the servants' corridor beyond the eastern door, where the walls were plain stone without murals, and the lighting was functional rather than magnificent, and no one was watching because there was nothing here worth watching. Then she stopped walking. She put her back against the cold stone wall. She breathed. In the corridor's particular silence, the mate bond hummed in her chest with the low, aching persistence of something that did not know it had been publicly executed. Instinct did not care about politics. It did not care about bloodlines or nobility or the careful architecture of imperial succession. It cared about proximity and about the specific gravity of a person the universe had decided was structurally necessary to you. And it did not stop caring simply because that person had looked at the full weight of what you were to each other and described it as nothing. She pressed the back of her skull against the wall and felt the cold of it conduct through bone. You knew. She said it out loud, to herself, in the empty corridor. You knew he wasn't going to choose you. You knew that months ago. You knew it before you walked into that hall tonight. You have known it every time he corrected his attention away from you, every time he looked and then looked away, every time he let Morvain stand at his side like she had already been decided upon. You knew. Knowing and experiencing are different countries with no common border. She had known. And it had still cut through to something that knowing couldn't reach. She gave herself 60 seconds. She had learned this in the palace. The discipline of allotting grief its specific portion of time and then requiring it to become functional, because grief in rooms adjacent to power was a vulnerability that people who wanted to survive could not afford to let run unchecked. 60 seconds of her back against cold stone, and the mate bond aching in her chest, and the words circling without being able to land anywhere stable. She means nothing. At 60 seconds, she pushed off the wall. She went to the chambers she had occupied for 4 years. Small rooms near the palace's lower residential wing, not the servant quarters, but not the noble wing either, that in-between space her entire existence had occupied. She packed what she needed, not what she had accumulated, not the small archive of possessions that form the physical memory of a life in a place, but what she needed. A change of clothing, a knife she had carried since she was 14, a pouch of coin, her own earnings from years of message carrying and corridor intelligence, a heavy cloak the color of old ash. She was done in 11 minutes. The eastern gate of Moonfang Palace was used by suppliers and minor staff, wide enough for carts and usually attended by 2 guards, whose primary function was cursory and whose actual attention was elsewhere. She had moved through it hundreds of times. They recognized her without interest, and she walked through it without ceremony, and the gate closed behind her with the particular thud of something heavy and definitive. And Celine Vire stood in the frozen outer courtyard of the palace she had called home for 14 years and felt the night air hit her face for the first time without the filter of royal walls. She did not look back. That was the thing about survival. The people who looked back in the moment of departure were the ones who hesitated. And hesitation in the cold, with no bloodline and no title, and an empire behind you that had just publicly declared you to be nothing, was not something she could afford. She walked north toward the city gates. The empire opened around her. Winter in the outer provinces of Veilor was not the winter of palace corridors kept warm by underground heating systems and the body heat of 100 servants. It was the real thing, brutal and indifferent and enormously clarifying in the way that only genuine discomfort ever was. By the 3rd day, she was beyond the empire's main roads. By the 3rd day, she had also discovered something that the soft machinery of palace life had never been able to teach her. She was considerably more competent than she had been given space to demonstrate. The first night she slept rough in the abandoned hollow of a granite outcropping 10 miles north of the capital, the cold attacking her clothing with the methodical persistence of something that had been doing this for centuries and had no intention of stopping. She built a fire with techniques she had learned from a soldier who passed through the palace 7 years ago during a winter campaign. She ate dried provisions she had packed with the calculation of someone who understood mathematics and distance. She slept 3 hours, woke when the fire dropped below useful warmth, rebuilt it, and slept 3 more. She was not comfortable. She was alive. There was a philosophy in that distinction that she had not fully appreciated before she needed it. The second day brought snow and a secondary road populated by the kind of traffic that main roads in Empire territories didn't attract. War refugees from the eastern border conflict that the palace dispatched official reports about in carefully sanitized language. Mercenary units traveling in small groups with weapons unconcealed. Farmers moving livestock to markets in the western provinces where blood taxes were marginally lower. Celine moved among them in her gray cloak and her functional boots, and her expression of competent disinterest that the palace had taught her without intending to, the face of someone who belonged to the same category of invisible that made rooms look away. No one stopped her. On the 4th day, she reached a town called Greyvast. It was the kind of town the Empire acknowledged on maps in the smallest print, the category of settlement that existed to pay taxes and provide conscripts and otherwise justify its occupation of imperial territory by staying out of the way. 300 residents, maybe more in the surrounding farmland, a market square with a well and 2 merchant stalls. A tavern that served as the community's primary multipurpose facility, courthouse and meeting hall and rumor exchange all compressed under one low roof. She went in because she needed information and because she had enough coin to pay for it in the form of a meal and the goodwill it generated. The tavern was warm, the way places are warm when they have no choice but to be, when warmth is generated by the collective body heat of people who cannot afford to be cold. Crowded tables, smoke from a fire that needed a better draft, the smell of cheap meat and cheaper wine, and the specific human scent of people who worked outdoors and didn't have access to the palace's bathing arrangements. She found a table near the wall. Old habit, she always found the table near the wall. The woman who brought her food was perhaps 50, Built with the durability of someone who had been performing physical labor since adolescence, her hands carrying the particular calluses of work that didn't pause for seasons. "Passing through?" the woman asked. Not unfriendly, pragmatic. "Heading north," Celine said. "What's the condition of the frontier road?" The woman looked at her with the appraisal of someone who had developed accurate read on strangers as a survival skill equivalent to the one Celine had developed inside the palace, just applied to different information. "Terrible," she said. "Bandit activity doubled since the border patrols got pulled back in autumn. Empire decided the Eastern Front needed more boots." A pause. "They didn't ask Gravast." "They rarely ask," Celine said. Something shifted in the woman's expression, the start of a real conversation rather than the functional one. "Where are you coming from?" Celine considered her answer with the same care she applied to everything. "The capital," she said. It was true. "I served in Moonfang Palace." The woman set down the pitcher she was carrying. Not dramatically, just set it down with a deliberateness that indicated she was no longer multitasking. "Served," she repeated. "Past tense." Past tense. Another appraisal. "What's it like?" the woman said. "In there, the real version, not the version the Imperial notices describe." And there it was. The question Celine had been asked 100 times by people who sensed she had access to something they didn't, and which she had always deflected, because deflection inside the palace was survival, and information was currency, and you didn't spend currency carelessly. But she was outside the palace now. She had been declared nothing by the person with the power to make declarations. The information she carried was no longer leverage. It was just truth. "It's magnificent," Celine said, "and it is rotten to the support beams." The woman pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Her name was Marin. She had been in Gravast her entire life, had watched 3 different iterations of imperial policy grind through the town like water through limestone, and she had the memory of someone who understood that history was not what official documents said it was. "Blood taxes are up 30% this cycle," Marin said. 3 families in the northern district lost their farms to the levy. The youngest son of one of those families got himself conscripted for the Eastern Campaign 6 months ago. She paused. "They haven't heard from him since spring." Celine listened. This was a skill she had refined to an art form. The ability to listen with her full attention without performing attention, to simply receive information and allow the speaker to feel received without the distortion of performative sympathy or the agenda of someone extracting. "The Empire's magnificent in the capital," Marin continued, "because the capital is where the money from places like Gravast ends up. We pay for those chandeliers." She looked at Celine with the directness of someone who had earned the right to be direct. "You know that." "I know that," Celine said. "And you left anyway, past tense." Something made leaving easier than staying. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood and retrieved the pitcher. "There's a room upstairs," she said. "One night. You look like you need to sleep somewhere with a ceiling. I can pay." "I know you can. It's still one night. After that, the frontier road is north-northeast. Ask for Waylon at the 3rd crossroads. He runs a small trading post, knows that territory better than anyone. Don't travel after dark. The bandits working that stretch are organized." A pause. "Someone's organizing them. Nobody knows who yet." Celine filed that. She slept that night in a room with a ceiling and a door that latched, and she did not dream. And in the morning she left Gravast with more information than she had arrived with, and a specific thread of intelligence, organized banditry on the frontier road, that she had attached to a larger pattern she was beginning to assemble. The empire Darius ruled was magnificent and rotten, and rot, when left unaddressed, did not stay contained. Halted. The frontier road north of the 3rd crossroads was exactly as Marin had described, which was to say it was hostile in the specific way that neglected infrastructure became hostile when the power responsible for maintaining it decided that something else mattered more. The road surface had crumbled in sections. Bridges over the smaller tributaries of the River Vian had boards missing and no indication that anyone with authority to repair them intended to. The forest on both sides pressed closer than it should have, which meant the regular clearing campaigns had stopped, which meant the patrols had definitely been pulled back. Celine moved at pace. She had purchased a longer blade in Gravast from a merchant who sold equipment without asking about purpose, and she had rebalanced the weight distribution of her pack so the heaviest items sat higher on her spine, the way the soldier who taught her fire building had also taught her to carry load. The blade sat at her right hip. She had trained with blades since she was 16, self-taught, from observation, and from the occasional willing instruction of the palace guard, who had never imagined she was learning in order to one day need it. She found Waylon at the trading post, a lean, wind-burned man in his late 40s who communicated primarily in precise information and charged fairly for supplies. "Ashen Frontier," she said, when she told him where she was heading. He looked at her for a moment. "Nobody goes to the frontier. Somebody should. It's abandoned." "I know. After the Nithris purge, it's been considered—" He stopped. "You know your history. I know enough of it." Another look. The particular evaluation of someone assessing how much truth a person could handle. "There are people living in the Edge territories," he said finally. "Not Empire people. Old clan remnants mostly. A few hermits, exiles." He paused. "A man called Kaelor Vane has a settlement of sorts in the volcanic zone near the old Nithris temple ruins. If you run into trouble out there, his group won't kill you first. That's about the best I can offer." "It's enough," Celine said. She paid for supplies and left. The Ashen Frontier began on the other side of a ridge that the Empire had named on maps and then forgotten. The landscape changed with the specificity of somewhere that had undergone geological trauma and never fully recovered. Volcanic rock breaking through thin soil, the remnants of ancient lava flows that had cooled into strange formations, the skeletal remains of what had once been a forest and was now a field of petrified columns. The air carried sulfur at the lower elevation and something older and less nameable higher up, near the ruins of House Nithris. She had not known she was looking for them. She had told herself she was heading north because north was away from the palace, and away from Darius, and away from the specific geography of her humiliation. But when she saw the first carved stone emerging from the volcanic earth, a wolf's head in black basalt with eyes that had been set with something dark and reflective and long since looted, she understood that some part of her had known exactly where she was going. She crouched beside the stone and put her palm flat against it. The cold came up through her hand and into her wrist and her forearm, and continued up her shoulder and into her chest, where it met something that was already cold for different reasons. And beneath that cold, beneath the ache of the mate bond and the three words she could not stop hearing in the resonant voice of the man who had said them, beneath all of that, she felt something else, something that pushed back. Not warmth, not exactly, more like pressure. Like the sensation of standing at the edge of a significant drop and feeling the air rise to meet you, and understanding that the air knows you are there. She lifted her hand, looked at her palm. Nothing visible. She stood. "You felt that." The voice came from her left and above her. The top of a basalt formation 6 feet high, where a man was sitting in a crouch that suggested he had been there considerably longer than she had been in the ruins. He was perhaps 55, built in the manner of someone who had once been exceptionally dangerous and had simply converted that danger from active to potential, the way old volcanoes converted their energy into heat without eruption. His face carried scars that were not decorative, a burn that had taken part of his left ear, and the skin from cheekbone to jaw on that side, and his eyes were the particular pale gray of someone whose gaze had been trained on threats at distance. Kaelor Vane. She did not ask. She knew. "I felt something," she said. He dropped from the formation in a single motion, landing without the impact she expected, and stood 6 feet from her with his arms at his sides and his eyes on her face. "Most people who touch that stone feel nothing. The ones who felt what you felt are dead." A pause. "Most of them died during the purge. A few died afterward, trying to come back. And the ones who survived? I'm looking at one of them." Celine held very still. "You don't know who I am." "No, but I know what you are." He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat and produced a folded document, aged to the yellow of something preserved carefully over years, and held it out to her. "Because I've been waiting for someone who could touch that stone and not fall." She took the document, unfolded it. The handwriting was old, in the formal script of 2 generations past, and it took her a moment to orient to the letter forms. But the family tree drawn in its margins was clear. The line of descent from House Nithris through the generations, each name noted in careful ink, and at the bottom, in a hand different from the document's main text added later, 2 names. One crossed out, one with a question mark. She looked at the crossed out name, then at the date beside it. The date was her birthday. She looked up at Kaylor Vane. His expression held the specific patience of someone who had been carrying a piece of information for a very long time and had finally found its recipient. The crossed-out name, he said, was your mother. She survived the purge because Thorne's father believed she was dead. She wasn't. A pause. She made certain of it. She never told me. She couldn't. Not until you were old enough to handle it, and she died before you were. He held her gaze. The question mark is yours. Has been yours since the day they brought you to the palace as an orphan. Celine looked back at the document, at her name, or rather, at the space where her name should be, at the question mark standing in for a certainty that someone had not wanted to commit to an ink until the question mark could be replaced. She was not an orphan. She was the last heir of House Nithris, the bloodline that had been erased for daring to challenge imperial succession. And the stone she had touched, the volcanic basalt carved with her ancestor's sigil, had responded to her the way it had responded to no one since the purge. "What is Shadowfire?" she said. She had heard the word before once, in a fragment of palace gossip she had filed away years ago, marked as irrelevant. Irrelevant information had a way of reclassifying itself. Kaylor Vane looked at her for a moment with an expression she would come to recognize over the weeks that followed. The expression of someone considering how much truth to introduce at once and deciding on all of it. "It is what your bloodline carries," he said. "What it has always carried. The reason the Thorne dynasty purged your family had nothing to do with the challenge to succession." He paused. "It was because your ancestors could do something that frightened an Alpha King badly enough to justify genocide." He looked at her hands. She looked at her hands. And as she watched, as she held the document with her mother's crossed-out name and her own question mark, and the truth of 14 years rearranging itself into a different shape, as all of that happened at once in the cold of the ashen frontier, with the sulfur in the air and the ruins of her actual home around her, a darkness moved. Not shadow, not the absence of light. Something with weight, with direction. It rose from her palms like something waking, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be called by its correct name. Kaylor Vane did not step back. He nodded. "There it is," he said quietly. And behind them, somewhere deep in the ruins, something in the volcanic stone began to hum in response. The weeks that followed did not resemble training in any form Celine had previously encountered. Kaylor was not a kind teacher. He was not unkind either, which was its own kind of discipline. He had no interest in performing either softness or cruelty, which meant there was no performance for her to calibrate to, no emotional weather to read and navigate. There was only work, clear standards. The expectation of failure followed without sentiment by the expectation of attempting again. "You're fighting it," he said on the 5th morning, after she had spent 2 hours attempting to call the Shadowfire and produced nothing but sweat and a headache that felt like something was pressing on her skull from inside. "I'm concentrating," she said. "You're fighting. There's a difference." He was sitting on a rock formation 6 feet away, arms crossed, watching her with the patience of a man who had exactly as much time as this required and no anxiety about how long that would be. Concentration is what you do when you're working with something. Fighting is what you do when you're trying to force something to obey you. "It's power," she said. "Power should respond to will. Power responds to truth," he said. "Will is what you perform for other people. Truth is what you are when no one's watching." He looked at her with those pale gray eyes. "When no one's watching, what are you angry about?" She did not answer immediately. The wind moved through the volcanic columns. Above them, a sky the color of old pewter pressed down on the frontier with the indifference of weather. "The waste," she said finally. "Say it plainly. The waste of it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 14 years inside a palace learning to be invisible so I could survive in a place where I never belonged. Learning every corridor and every conversation and every piece of political intelligence in the empire, not because I was preparing for anything, but because it was the only way I knew to justify my existence in a space that would have discarded me without a second thought if I stopped being useful. She breathed, and I was still discarded, with an audience. And she looked at him. And I'm angry that the bond existed, that it was real. I'm angry that for 18 months I stood at the edge of something the universe apparently decided about without consulting me, and I was careful and patient and measured, and I told myself it was intelligence and it was survival and it was the right thing to do, and none of it changed what happened. The outcome was the same whether I was careful or reckless. The outcome had already been decided. Her jaw set. I'm angry that I let the outcome be decided without me in the room. Kaylor Vane said nothing for a moment. Then, now call it. She looked at her hands, and this time the shadow fire came. Not violent, not the explosive eruption she had been expecting, the dramatic manifestation of something with this much weight behind it. It came the way truth usually did when you finally said it correctly, quietly, completely, with a certainty that made the waiting seem strange in retrospect. It moved along her fingers like dark current, dimensionless and impossibly present, carrying the specific gravity of something that was part of her nervous system rather than outside it. She held it. It held. Good, Kaylor said. She looked up at him. That's the first step, he said. The rest is learning to use it without letting it use you. He uncrossed his arms and stood. The power doesn't care about your anger. It responds to it because anger, when it's honest anger, is the closest most people ever get to telling the full truth about themselves. But if you let anger become the engine, you'll burn everything you're trying to build. He looked at her steadily, including yourself. What does it respond to after anger? He considered this with the seriousness he applied to everything. Certainty, he said. The kind that doesn't require approval. The kind that exists whether or not anyone witnesses it. He looked at her. You had that once in the palace. You called it survival. You're going to need a larger version of it before this is done. She let the shadow fire dim, slowly, the way she had learned to moderate breath. The cold of the frontier rushed back in. Before what is done, she said, you haven't told me what you're preparing me for. Kaylor looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the ruins of House Nitherus stood in the volcanic cold, her family's history preserved in basalt and patience. I'm not preparing you for anything, he said. I'm preparing you to be ready for whatever you decide to do. A pause. The question of what that is, that one's yours. Celine looked at the ruins, at the stone she had touched on her first day, the wolf's head in black basalt with its dark, empty eye sockets. The empire is rotting from the inside, she said. Yes. And the king doesn't know it, or knows it and has decided that the rot is the price of the order he maintains. Which is worse? Kaylor asked. She didn't answer immediately because the question deserved the weight she gave it. The second one, she said finally, ignorance can be corrected, but a man who has decided that something acceptable can be sacrificed. He has already become the thing that needs replacing. She felt the certainty of the statement as she said it, not performed certainty, the real kind. Kaylor nodded once. Then you have your answer, he said. 6 weeks into her time on the frontier, a rider came from the east. He was one of Kaylor's people. The settlement in the volcanic zone had grown around him the way settlements grew around any person with enough competence and enough lack of cruelty to be genuinely trusted. A collection of exiles and frontier survivors, and people the Empire had forgotten on purpose. His name was Dort. 19 years old, fast on horseback, and observant in the way young people were observant when they had grown up in places where missing information had consequences. Imperial dispatch riders on the frontier road, he said, still on his horse, not bothering to dismount because the news had enough urgency that dismounting felt like a delay. Full company, not a patrol. They're moving like they have a specific destination. Kaylor looked at Celine. She was standing in the practice ground they had cleared near the temple ruins, her hands at her sides, the shadow fire dormant, but present the way a fire banked for the night was still present. Contained, not extinguished. How many? She asked Dort. 50 cavalry. 2 banner commanders. And, he paused, and a man in war pelts without insignia, moving at the front, not with the column, moving the way. He stopped again. Like he owns the territory he's moving through, Celine said. Dort looked at her. Yeah, exactly like that. She turned to Kaylor. Something had happened in her face. Not expression, exactly. Something beneath expression. The quality of her attention sharpening to a point that had a very specific target. He came himself, she said. Kaylor's jaw was tight. He's looking for the source of the Border Clan activity. Our people have been too visible. No, she said. He's looking for me. The certainty in her voice was not the certainty of fear or of hope, or of the particular aching complexity of a mate bond that had been publicly discarded and still, against all reason, persisted. It was the certainty of someone who had spent 4 years reading a room and understood, with the clarity of honest assessment, that a king who dismissed someone publicly did not send 50 cavalry into abandoned frontier territory because of Border Clan disruption. He had felt her, the shadow fire, the power awakening in the Nytheris ruins. Whatever signal that sent through the channels that connected the mate bond, he had felt it, and it had unsettled something he had spent 6 weeks trying to not be unsettled by. Good. Let him be unsettled. We're not running, she said. Kaylor looked at her. The long look of a strategist assessing readiness. 6 weeks, he said, is what I have. Against 50 cavalry and a King Alpha in full war mode. I'm not going to war with him. Her voice was steady. Not today. She looked north toward the ridge that separated the frontier from the frontier road. Today I'm going to let him see what I've become. Kaylor Vane, who had been a war strategist for 23 years before exile, who had seen campaigns designed by some of the finest military minds in Valor's history, looked at Celine Vaillere, last heir of House Nytheris, 6 weeks into her inheritance of a power that kings had committed genocide to eradicate, and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. She turned to Dort. Bring the others. I want 10 of our best riders at the North Ridge in 2 hours. She paused. Armed but not armored. I want him to understand the difference. Dort looked at Kaylor. Kaylor gave him a single nod. Dort turned his horse and went. Celine looked at her hands. The shadow fire stirred. She thought of the banquet hall, of the 40 feet of stone ceiling and the chandeliers made from crystal bone and the specific silence of a room that had just watched a king declare his mate to be nothing. She thought of the pale gray quality of the air in the servants' corridor afterward. She thought of the 60 seconds she had allowed herself against the cold stone wall. She thought of 3 words. She means nothing. And she thought of a version of those words that was now true, not as correction, not as the particular defiance of someone trying to prove a wound wrong, but as simple, structural fact. She is, as it turns out, everything. She pulled the shadow fire to her hands, let it move from her fingers to her forearms, let it settle around her like something that had been waiting all her life to be properly introduced. 2 hours north. A king who had made the mistake of believing that dismissal was the same as erasure. And somewhere in the volcanic columns around her, the ruins of House Nytheris hummed in frequencies too low to hear, but not too low to feel, as if the dead were paying attention, as if they had been waiting too. She walked north, and behind her, in the earth beneath the old wolf headstone, something cracked. Not broke. Cracked. The way bedrock cracks before something beneath it finally, after pressure beyond calculation, chooses to rise. The north ridge of the Ashen frontier looked out over a valley that the Empire had decided 2 generations ago was not worth the cost of maintaining. It was a decision that made tactical sense at the time. After the Nytheris Purge, after the volcanic zone had been scraped of its most valuable bloodline and its most dangerous inheritance, there was nothing here that Valor needed. The mineral deposits in the eastern sections had been stripped and catalogued and mostly exhausted within a generation. The remaining clans were too fractured and too small to constitute a military threat. The frontier served no trade route of consequence, so the Empire had filed it under the administrative category of territories held by presence alone and moved its attention and its resources to places that produce better returns. The Empire had not considered that abandoned places had a way of producing exactly the kind of return that empires were least prepared to receive. Celine stood on the ridge's highest point and looked north. She could see the column from here. 50 cavalry on the frontier road below the tree line, their formation precise in the way that imperial military training made formations precise, moving through the landscape with the organizational confidence of people who understood themselves to be the authority in any territory they entered. The banner commanders rode near the front. No insignia on the banners today. She had noted that immediately, the absence of the Crimson Wolf standard, which meant this was not an official military operation, which meant Darius had come on something closer to personal business. Beside her, Kaelor Vane stood with his arms crossed and his pale gray eyes tracking the same column with the assessment of a man who had spent 2 decades planning the kind of campaigns that columns like that one were designed to execute. He had said nothing since they reached the ridge. The quality of his silence was that of someone running calculations. "He's not in the column," she said. "No." Flanking, east side of the ridge. Kaelor did not look at her. He moved off the main road 20 minutes before they reached the valley floor. "I had Dort tracking. He's coming up from below. He'll reach this position in approximately 15 minutes, she said. Not a question. Kaelor looked at her then, the particular look he had developed over 6 weeks of watching her recalibrate, assessing not what she knew, but what she had become capable of knowing. "The bond," he said. "The bond," she confirmed. This was the thing that no amount of dismissal could legislate out of existence. The mate bond was not sentiment. It was not the romantic architecture of people who needed their lives to have narrative coherence. It was biological and instinctive, and as indifferent to the preferences of kings and orphans as the volcanic geology around them. She knew where Darius was the way she knew where her own heartbeat was, not as information she processed, but as information her nervous system carried without her permission. He was below the eastern slope, moving fast, alone. That detail mattered. She turned it over in her mind with the same methodical care she applied to everything now, the habit Kaelor had reinforced relentlessly. Never receive information without evaluating what it revealed about the person who generated it. A king who came to unfamiliar territory with 50 cavalry, left them on the road, and came up the ridge alone was either arrogant beyond calculation or was making a statement that required the absence of witnesses. She suspected it was both. Her 10 riders were positioned below and behind her, where the ridge's western slope provided coverage. Kaelor had insisted on that positioning, and she had agreed. Not because she expected to need them today, but because she understood what Kaelor understood, that a leader who stood on a ridge alone to make a point was different from a leader who stood on a ridge alone because she had no one. The first was choice. The second was exposure. She had no intention of ever again being in a position where the distinction was unclear. The shadow fire moved at the edges of her awareness, banked and present, the way it always was now after 6 weeks of daily work. She did not call it up. She let it be where it was. Kaelor had spent 3 of those 6 weeks drilling this specific discipline into her, with the particular patience of someone who had seen what happened when people with significant power defaulted to demonstration. "You don't show power to prove you have it," he had told her, the day after she had pushed the shadow fire further than control allowed and blown out the eastern face of a practice formation. "You show power when the showing changes something. Everything else is performance, and performance tells your opponent where your confidence lives." She heard him before she saw him. She saw, not his footsteps. The volcanic rock absorbed sound differently than the palace marble she had spent 14 years learning to move across. And Darius moved with the particular quiet of a trained fighter who understood terrain. What she heard was the change in the wind, the way it moved differently when a person with that specific mass and presence occupied a space they had not previously occupied. She did not turn. She heard him come up the last section of the ridge path and stop. Silence. She gave it 4 full seconds. Then she turned. He looked exactly as she remembered, and nothing at all like it. The war pelts Dort had described, not the ceremonial ones he wore in the throne room, but functional traveling pelts, gray and black and worn with use. No crown, no imperial chain. The scar from ear to chin caught the light the way it always did, the ridge of it pale against the darker skin beneath. He was breathing from the climb, not heavily but measurably, and his eyes, dark gray, the color of the ridge stone around them, were on her with an attention that had none of the correcting qualities she had spent 18 months cataloging. No correction. No looking away. He looked at her the way he had looked at her for 4 seconds at the Winter Ascension banquet before Seraphine Morvain had appeared at his right, and the 4 seconds had ended. Except this time there was no one at his right, and the 4 seconds did not end. He looked at her hands first, at the faint darkness that lived at the edges of her fingers, now even when the shadow fire was banked, the permanent trace of an inheritance that had been waking for 6 weeks. Then at her face. Whatever he had expected to find here, it was not what he found. She watched him process the gap between expectation and reality, and she felt, which surprised her, because she had believed she had moved past this. She felt a specific, clean satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with the relief of being accurately seen. "Celine," he said. One word. Her name. In his voice, which the bond still responded to against her preferences. "Darius," she said, "not your majesty. Not a title. His name." She watched him register the absence of deference with the specific attention of someone who understood the language of social architecture precisely enough to know when a brick had been removed from the foundation. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the ridge. Below, the imperial column was still visible at the valley floor, holding its position with the discipline of soldiers who had been told to hold and had not been told why. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "Yes." "You didn't contact the palace?" "No. I expected—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and contained. The reports from the border clans started arriving 3 weeks ago. Villages that had been paying to mercenary units for protection for 2 years. Routes that our patrols had stopped covering. He paused. All of it changing. "I know," she said. "You did that. Some of it." She held his gaze. "Kaylor Vane and the people here did the infrastructure work. I contributed strategy." The name landed. She saw it. Kaylor Vane was not unknown in imperial military circles. He was the kind of figure whose exile left a specific shape in the structure he had occupied, the outline of someone who had been removed because he was too effective and too principled to be comfortably managed. "You found Vane," Darius said. "He found me. He was waiting." She paused deliberately. "He's been waiting for a very long time." There was a specific quality to the silence between them now. Not the emptiness of two people who had nothing to say. The density of two people who had too much. Darius took 2 steps toward her, stopped, 6 feet between them. She did not move. "Why?" he said. Not what she had expected. She had expected something political, an inquiry about allegiances. A demand to understand the strategic shape of what was happening on the frontier. What he said instead was the kind of question that stripped the diplomatic frame off a conversation and put the actual architecture on display. "Why did I leave?" she said. "Or why did I come here? Why are you doing this?" He gestured, a short controlled motion, indicating the ridge and below it the valley, and below that the 6 weeks of activity that had sent reports back to a palace she had left in 11 minutes. "What are you building?" "I'm not ready to answer that question to you," she said. "Not yet." The pause that followed had texture. "Not yet," he repeated. "Not yet." He looked at her with the particular focus of someone decoding a statement that carried more information than its surface words. She understood the decoding process because she had watched him deploy it in palace meetings for 4 years. He was efficient with it. He arrived at conclusions faster than most people arrived at their first interpretation. His jaw tightened slightly. "You're not running," he said. "No. You're not hiding. Obviously not. And you're not negotiating. Not today." He breathed through that. "Then what is today?" She held her ground and looked at him with the full attention she had spent 4 years carefully modulating and 6 weeks learning to stop modulating, because the modulation had been a form of protection, and protection had a cost that she was no longer willing to pay. "Today is you seeing that I exist," she said. "The real version. Without the palace walls and without the gray dress and without the 14 years of careful invisibility I cultivated, because it was the only way to stay alive in a space that didn't have a category for me." She felt the shadow fire stir at her hands and let it, just enough, just the faint visible darkness at her fingertips. "You declared me nothing in front of every bloodline in Valor. Today is you understanding that the declaration was incorrect. Sirbasi Tirsara what? Something happened in Darius Thorne's expression that she had never seen there before. Not anger, not the cold authority that the throne room version of him projected as a default. Something older than that. Something that lived beneath the architecture of kingship, and had probably been there long before he was old enough to sit on an obsidian throne. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the earliest stages of a reckoning. Here was the thing about Alpha Kings and the particular pathology of power. They did not typically encounter the experience of being wrong in a way that could not be administratively corrected. Wrong decisions could be reversed. Wrong appointments could be dismissed. Wrong campaigns could be reframed as strategic retreats. The machinery of governance provided almost infinite tools for managing the gap between what a ruler decided and what reality turned out to be. The gap could always be bridged, papered over, declared resolved by someone with sufficient authority. What the machinery could not manage, what it had never been designed to manage, was the gap between what a person decided someone was worth and what that person turned out to actually be. Because that gap did not exist in the administrative record. It existed in the space between two people, and it could not be papered over, and no amount of authority altered the fact of it. Darius Thorne was looking at Celine Vare and experiencing, possibly for the first time in a decade of rule, the specific sensation of being completely unable to make the gap go away. "The shadow fire," he said. His voice was careful in a way that voices became careful when they were managing something difficult. "You have the Nytheris inheritance." "I am the Nytheris inheritance," she said. "That bloodline was purged, yes, by your father." She kept her voice even, not cold, even. There was a difference that mattered. He believed he had finished the job. He was wrong, and I spent 14 years living inside the palace he built over the ruin of my family's legacy, carrying your messages and witnessing your political arrangements and surviving in the spaces between royalty and servitude. And no one, not once in 14 years, thought to look at the orphan in gray and ask what she might be carrying. He was very still. This was characteristic of him under real pressure. The stillness that looked from the outside like calm, but was actually the physical expression of a mind running at capacity. She had observed it in council meetings. It looked different now, this close, in the open air of the frontier without the institutional furniture of kingship around him. It looked more like what it actually was. He was working through something that did not resolve easily. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. If I had—" "I'm not asking for that," she said, and the cleanness of it surprised him. She could see that. He had braced for recrimination, and she had offered him something more difficult. The refusal to make the conversation about his ignorance, which would have been easier for both of them. "The bloodline is not the point. The point is what happened in that banquet hall, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying this as the heir of House Nytheris." She paused. "I'm saying it as the woman you looked at and decided was an inconvenience to be managed. The wind came across the ridge between them. Darius looked at her for a long time. "She means nothing," he said, repeating his own words back with a precision that cost him something. "In front of 40 noble houses and every bloodline in the empire, yes." She held his gaze. "I want to know if you believed it when you said it." The question was not the question he had expected. She could see that too. He had probably anticipated anger, or grief, or the particular combination of both that the rejected mate bond generated in most people. The combustible emotion that was easiest to handle because it was easiest to dismiss. What she was offering instead was an inquiry, a cold, clear, serious question about the internal state of the man who had made the declaration. It was a much harder thing to stand in front of. He looked away from her for the first time. Not evasion. She had learned to read the difference between evasion and the genuine need for a moment that a direct gaze made impossible. He looked out over the valley, at the column of his cavalry still holding position on the road below, and he breathed once, deliberately. "No," he said. She waited. "I didn't believe it." His jaw was tight. "I knew what the bond was. I knew—" He stopped. Started differently. Seraphine's family holds the Eastern trade contracts. 3 of the largest provincial lords have already committed their military support to the Morvain alliance. The political calculus of choosing a woman with no bloodline and no title and no alliances over a match that stabilized the eastern provinces was... He stopped again. Something in his face, brief and honest in a way that she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be, especially here, out in the open, without witnesses and without the institutional role to hide inside. It was easier, he said, to say nothing, to make you the problem that got managed. There it was. Not cruelty. Not the monstrous indifference that would have been easier to hate and easier to walk away from permanently. Something more human and therefore more damaging. The specific cowardice of a man who had made a calculation and then dressed it as decision and then performed the decision in public before he could reverse it. She had suspected this. Knowing and experiencing were still different countries. Easier, she said. Yes? Easier than acknowledging the bond in front of every noble house in Valor and dealing with the political fallout. Yes. So you destroyed something real to preserve something convenient. He looked back at her. Yes. The word landed with the weight of something he had been carrying since that night and was now finally setting down somewhere. She breathed. Here was where it got complicated. Here was where the story of the rejected mate, in most of its common forms, resolved itself into one of two directions: reconciliation or war, forgiveness or devastation. The emotional logic was clean and comprehensible and deeply, structurally wrong, because it assumed that the only options available were the ones that had existed before the departure. The departure had generated new options. "I'm not here to give you what you came looking for," she said. He looked at her. "What did I come looking for?" "You came looking for the version of this conversation where I'm still the girl in gray who survived on the margins of your empire and waited for you to decide she mattered. Where you make a gesture of acknowledgement and she receives it with the gratitude of someone who has been given something she spent years waiting for." She held his gaze without apology. "That conversation ended 6 weeks ago, on the ridge, when I found out who I am." "And who are you?" The shadow fire came up fully then. Not a threat. Not a demonstration. The way fire comes up when it has been contained long enough and the container finally opens. Natural, inevitable, the simple expression of something returning to its correct state. It moved from her hands to her forearms to her shoulders, dimensionless and present, dark and alive. And in the light of the overcast frontier sky, it looked like what it was. An inheritance asserting itself through the person who carried it. "The last heir of a bloodline your father tried to erase," she said. "And the woman who is going to make sure that the rot your empire is dying of doesn't consume the people who can't afford to survive it." She watched him look at the shadow fire, watched him take in what it meant. Not the power itself, which he had the alpha instinct to assess and had clearly already assessed, but what it represented. The Nithorus bloodline alive. The purge incomplete. An inheritance that had survived a genocide by hiding inside the palace that had ordered the genocide, waiting in gray in the corridors, carrying messages, watching and learning and surviving. For the first time in the conversation, she saw something that was not assessment in his expression, something that might have been, if she had been willing to name it, awe. "Celine," he said. "Don't," she said, not harshly, simply. "Whatever you were about to say, don't say it yet. You don't have the right to the version of this conversation where you acknowledge what I am, and that acknowledgement changes things. That right is earned, and you have a great deal of earning to do before we have that conversation." His jaw set. The instinct of a man who had not been told he had not earned something in a very long time moved through his expression like weather across open ground. She watched it arrive, and she watched him, with visible effort, hold it. "What are you asking for?" he said. "I'm not asking for anything yet." She let the shadow fire dim, slowly, deliberately. "But you should know, the border clan activity, the trade routes, the patrol districts that have started functioning again without your soldiers, that's going to continue. And it's going to grow. Because the people out here are not abstract political problems. They are people. And the empire that is supposed to provide them with order and protection has decided that their function is to provide the capital with revenue and conscripts. Managing an empire at this scale requires... I know exactly what it requires." The precision in her voice stopped him. "I spent 4 years listening to every strategic conversation that passed through Moonfang Palace, Darius. I know the provincial tax structures. I know the border campaign logistics. I know which lords are using the blood levy exemptions to build private militias and which merchant houses have bribed, which ministry officials to route trade contracts around the official channels. She watched his expression tighten. I know the Empire better than most of your council, because the invisible people in a room always know more than the visible ones. They have to. The silence between them was the longest yet. He looked at her with something that had moved past assessment into something more complicated and harder to name. The look of a man confronting the fact that the person he had dismissed as nothing had been, for 14 years, the most comprehensively informed individual in his palace, and that the dismissal had not erased the information, it had simply made it unavailable to him. Power was not simply the capacity to act. It was the capacity to access the truth about the conditions in which you were acting. And for 14 years, Darius Thorne had been operating in proximity to a truth he had not known he was unable to see. "You're building something," he said. "I told you I wasn't ready to answer that. I'm not asking for the answer, I'm telling you what I see." He held her gaze. "You're not just reorganizing border districts and reclaiming trade routes. You're building a base, infrastructure, the beginning of an alternative governance structure." He paused. "That is a declaration of intent, whether or not you've used those words yet." She said nothing. He took that as confirmation. "If you move against the Empire—" "I'm not moving against the Empire," she said. "I'm moving against what the Empire has become. Those are different things." "From the throne," he said. "They are not different things." "From the throne," she said, "you cannot see what the Empire has become, which is precisely the problem." His expression hardened. Not anger. The thing that existed beneath anger in men like him, the thing that anger was a performance of. The genuine article was quieter and more dangerous. "I have led this empire through 7 military campaigns, 3 succession crises, and a famine cycle that would have collapsed the western provinces if—" "I know," she said. "I know exactly what you've held together, and at what cost, and through what mechanisms. I also know what those mechanisms have cost the people who aren't in the room when the mechanisms are designed." She breathed. "You are not a bad ruler, Darius. You're a ruler who has confused the Empire's ability to maintain itself with the Empire's ability to serve its people. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the rot lives." He looked at her for a long time. The wind across the ridge moved between them like a third presence. Below, the column on the valley road held its position. "I came here to bring you back," he said finally. The words had the quality of something he had prepared and was now releasing with awareness that they would not land the way he had intended. "I know. That's not what's going to happen." "No," he breathed. "What is going to happen?" She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had spent 6 weeks learning to hold significant weight without flinching. "You're going to go back to Moonfang Palace, and you're going to think about what you saw on this ridge today, and you're going to have to decide, not for the bond, and not for me, and not for the political calculus of the Morvain Alliance. You're going to have to decide whether the empire you've built is the empire you intended to build, or whether it became something else while you were focused on holding it together. And if I decide, when you decide," she said, "you'll know where to find me." Another silence. This one felt different, settled. The silence of something that had found its current position and was resting there before the next movement. Darius looked at her. Not the assessing look, not the correcting look, not the 4-second look that had preceded, "She means nothing," a different look. One she didn't have a catalog entry for because it was new, and newness in the expressions of a man who had been a king for a decade was a significant data point. He turned, walked back toward the eastern slope path, stopped at the edge of the ridge, did not turn around. "Celine." "Yes, the Morvain Alliance." A pause, the weight of it deliberate. "It hasn't been formalized." She held very still. He went down the slope without another word. She listened to the sound of him descending, the careful, efficient movement of a trained fighter on uncertain terrain, until the sound was gone and there was only the wind and the valley below and the column of 50 cavalry that 12 minutes later she watched reverse its course on the frontier road and move south, back toward the capital. Kaelor Vane appeared at her shoulder with the quiet arrival of someone who had learned stillness in the same places where the alternative was violence. "Well," he said, He told me the Morvain alliance hasn't been finalized, she said. Kaylor was quiet for a moment. That could mean he's considering reversing it. Yes. Or it could mean he wants you to believe he is. To manage you the same way he manages every other political variable. Give you enough information to keep you in a particular position, waiting for a resolution that benefits him. Yes, she said, it could mean that. Which do you think it is? She looked at the empty road below, at the space where 50 cavalry had been and were no longer, at the frontier valleys stretching north toward the volcanic zone, and the ruins that had been her family's and were now, in the most structural sense, hers. I think, she said, that it doesn't matter. Kaylor looked at her. Either answer requires the same response from me, she said. Continue building. Continue growing. Make the alternative visible and undeniable. Because if he's sincere, the best thing I can do is demonstrate that what I'm building is real and sustainable and worth the cost of what comes next. And if he's managing me... She stopped, restarted. If he's managing me, then I need to be too large and too established to be managed. Kaylor said nothing for a moment. Then, when did you arrive at that? Somewhere between when he said she means nothing and when he stopped looking away, she said. She turned from the ridge and walked back toward the settlement. Winter broke slowly over the ashen frontier. The volcanic zone held its heat longer than the provinces to the north, a geological quirk that made the frozen season shorter and the growing season more complex. And Celine found herself learning the specific rhythms of a landscape that had its own rules and was not interested in accommodating people who hadn't taken the time to understand them. She took the time. Kaylor's settlement, which had grown in the 2 weeks since Darius's visit, from 40 people to 70 as word moved through the frontier's informal networks that something was taking shape in the volcanic zone, organized itself around the practical architecture of survival. Food stores, medical knowledge, the kind of accumulated expertise that communities developed when they understood that external support was not coming, and internal competence was the only reliable infrastructure. Celine worked alongside them. This was not strategy. This was instinct. She had spent 14 years learning that the invisible people in a room carried the operational knowledge that kept the room functional, and she was not going to build anything on the foundation of distance between herself and the people who actually did the work. She learned which medicinal plants grew in the volcanic soil from a woman named Cress, who had been a healer in the provincial north before the blood levy took her eldest son, and she decided that any territory the Empire wasn't interested in defending was territory worth defending herself. She learned defensive formations from a former border soldier named Wick, who had been discharged without pension when the Eastern Campaign reallocation stripped his unit of its command structure and left the men to find their own way home. She learned the specific texture of what the Empire's abandonment had done to people who had not chosen to be abandoned. And she filed it all in the architecture of her memory, where it joined the 14 years of palace intelligence, and the shape of what she was building clarified with each addition. On the 23rd day after Darius's visit, a writer arrived from Greyvast, not Dort. A woman she didn't recognize, young, travel-burned, carrying the kind of urgency that people carried when they had been told the information they carried was time-sensitive. She asked for Celine by name, which was itself information. The name was moving through networks that Celine had not specifically seeded it through, which meant it was moving on its own momentum. Celine met her at the settlement's eastern edge. Message from Marin, the woman said. She was perhaps 20, with the direct eye contact of someone who had learned not to perform deference to anyone whose worthiness of it had not been demonstrated. Celine appreciated that immediately. Imperial notice posted in Greyvast 3 days ago. Tax assessment revision. Effective immediately, 30% increase on the spring levy. Reason given is frontier pacification costs. Celine went still. Frontier pacification costs. The Empire had looked at the reorganization of border districts and trade routes and classified it not as evidence of governance failure, but as a threat requiring suppression. And it had allocated the cost of that suppression to the people closest to the frontier, the people who had the least capacity to absorb additional extraction and the fewest options for resistance. This was the thing about sophisticated power. It did not respond to challenges by correcting the conditions that generated them. It responded by increasing the cost of the challenge to the people the challenger was trying to protect. It made the challenger responsible, in the ledger of public perception, for the suffering its response generated. Marin's message continued through the writer. 6 families in the northern district of Greyvast had already received collection notices on the new assessment. 2 had indicated they could not pay. The official response had included the phrase necessary measures. Celine thanked the writer, arranged for her to be fed and given a place to rest. Then she found Kaylor. He was in the training area near the western columns, working with 3 of the newer arrivals on the kind of hand-to-hand combat that prioritized restraint over force. The specific curriculum of someone who understood that the capacity for violence and the wisdom about when to deploy it were different skills requiring separate cultivation. He looked at her face when she approached and stopped the session. She told him. He listened. When she finished, the quality of his silence was different from the calculating silence she was accustomed to from him. This one had heat in it, not rage, the controlled version that lived beneath rage in people who had learned to operate under extreme constraint. He told you the alliance wasn't finalized, Kaylor said. Yes. And 3 days later, a 30% frontier pacification levy. Yes. He looked at her with the directness of someone who was about to say something she needed to hear, rather than something she wanted to. Celine, this could be Seraphine Morvaine's move, not his. She has enough influence in the revenue ministry to push an assessment revision without direct royal order. If she understood what your presence on the frontier meant for the Morvaine alliance, then it's a move designed to force his hand, Celine said. Either he reverses it, which costs him the Morvaine alliance, or he allows it to stand, which tells me everything I needed to know. You're using this as a test. The situation is using itself as a test. She held his gaze. I didn't generate this, but I won't pretend it doesn't tell me something. Kaylor looked at her for a moment. Then, how long do you give him? She thought about the man on the ridge, the look that she didn't have a catalog entry for. She means nothing. And then the 2-week silence, and then frontier pacification costs. 10 days, she said, and if the levy stands at 10 days, she breathed once. Then we stop waiting for him to decide what the empire should be, she said, and we start showing people what it could be instead. Kaylor nodded. Once. He returned to his session. She walked back through the settlement, through the organized effort of 70 people building something the empire had not given them permission to build, past the ruins of the family she had not known she had, past the stone wolf's head in black basalt with its empty eye sockets that had felt her presence on the first day and responded. 10 days. It was, she understood, not actually about the levy. It was about whether a king who had looked at a woman on a ridge and seen for the first time the full weight of what he had dismissed, whether that king had the capacity to absorb that scene and act from it, or whether the institutional machinery of his crown would absorb the scene for him and produce, as it always produced, the response that protected the crown rather than the truth beneath it. Power did not corrupt the way people assumed. It did not take something clean and make it dirty. What it did was more specific and more insidious. It provided constant, sophisticated, institutionally supported justifications for prioritizing the structure of power over the people it was supposed to serve. Every decision made in the name of stability, in the name of the empire's continuity, in the name of what the long-term interests of the realm required, every single one of those decisions was rational within the logic of the system that generated it. And that was exactly what made the system so effective at destroying the things outside its logic that deserved to survive. Darius Thorne was not a cruel man. He was a man embedded so completely in a system that rewarded a particular kind of decision-making that he had never been required to develop the capacity for a different kind. The question was whether he could. The question, she had decided, was worth 10 days. On the 7th day, she was in the ruins working with the shadow fire, not in the practice sense, but in the exploratory sense that Kaylor had started encouraging, the practice of simply being present with the inheritance rather than deploying it, understanding its texture rather than its application. When Dort appeared at the edge of the ruins at a run, he stopped 6 feet from her, breathing hard. "Rider from the capital," he said. "Imperial seal, not a company. 1 rider, fast horse. Carrying a personal dispatch." She let the shadow fire settle. Who is it addressed to? Dort looked at her with the expression of someone delivering information that had already surprised him. "Celine of the Ashen Frontier," he said. Not Celine Vere. Not the orphan. He paused. Celine of the Ashen Frontier. She held that for a moment. The acknowledgement in that address was not incidental. A king who used the title a person had established for themselves rather than the administrative category they had previously occupied was making a statement about recognition, about changed perception. It did not resolve anything. It did not undo the levee or the banquet hall or 14 years of invisibility. But it was something. She followed Dort to where the rider was waiting. The dispatch was sealed with the royal mark, but not the imperial mark, a distinction she understood immediately. The royal mark was personal authority. The imperial mark was institutional authority. He had written as himself, not as the crown. She broke the seal. The letter was short. Darius was not a man who used more words than the situation required. It read, "The assessment revision is being reviewed. This takes 10 days minimum. I am telling you this because I believe you should know, and not because I expect it to change what you're doing. The frontier road patrols will not be extended into the volcanic zone during the review period. What I said on the ridge 3 weeks ago. I saw you. I am telling you that I saw you because I should have said it then and did not. This is not a negotiation. This is an acknowledgement." D. She read it twice. Then she folded it with the care of someone who understood that a document could be a weapon or a record or both, depending on who held it and when. Kaylor was at her shoulder again, in the way he had of appearing at moments when his presence was relevant. "Well," he said. Same word as before. "He's reviewing the levy," she said. "And?" She handed him the letter. He read it again, handed it back. "He's not asking for anything," Kaylor said. "No. That's either genuine or it's the most sophisticated version of asking for something I've seen in 20 years of watching kings operate." "Yes," she said. "Both options require the same response. Keep building." "Keep building." Kaylor was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular precision of a strategist who had just recalculated a campaign map, "He called you Celine of the Ashen Frontier." "Yes." "That's a title. One he's recognizing." "Yes." "He's acknowledging a power structure outside the Empire." "Yes." "Selenia Basis." Kaylor turned to look at her with the full force of 23 years of military intelligence assessment focused on a single point. "He's not reviewing the levy because he wants to. He's reviewing the levy because he's calculated that the alternative, the version where you respond to the levy the way a person building an opposition movement responds to direct provocation, is worse for him than the cost of the Morvain Alliance's displeasure." She looked at him. "He's afraid of what you're becoming," Kaylor said. She held that, not with satisfaction, with the specific clarity of someone who had been surviving long enough to know that fear in a powerful person was not safety for the person they feared. It was warning. "Then we have very little time," she said. Kaylor nodded. "The Morvain faction will not wait for the review to play out. If Seraphine understands what the title in that letter means, what him acknowledging you as Celine of the Ashen Frontier instead of the orphan from Moonfang means, she will move. What does she have? 3 of the Eastern Lords committed to the Alliance. The Revenue Ministry influence we already identified. And," he paused, "and the Provincial Garrison Commander at Duskwall, Rovin Kyle. He was Morvain aligned before the current deployment. If she calls the Alliance's military component before the review concludes—" "She doesn't need to wait for the review," Celine said. "She needs to act before the review concludes in Darius's favor, because a concluded review is a changed political reality that she cannot reverse. Her window is now." They looked at each other. The frontier settlement hummed around them, 70 people and their accumulated competence, and their specific, hard-earned knowledge of what survival required. And in the ruins at the center of it all, the Nitherese stone held its position in the volcanic earth the way it had held its position through a purge and 2 generations of imperial forgetting. "How long?" she asked. "Before Morvain moves?" Kaylor calculated with visible efficiency. "If she already knows about the letter, and she has palace sources, she will know. 3 days. Maybe 4. She'll move the Duskwall garrison under a provincial security pretext, something that gives the action official cover before anyone in the capital can respond. 3 days. Celine looked north, toward the upper frontier, toward the territory she had been building through for 6 weeks. toward the clan leaders who had started attending the settlement's council meetings, not because she had invited them, but because word had moved through the networks that something was taking shape here that was worth attending. 3 days to consolidate what 6 weeks had built. 3 days to make clear to every clan and every frontier settlement and every person who had started believing that something was changing. 3 days to make it undeniable that it was. Dort, she said. Dort had not left. Good instincts. Writers to every council contact we have within a day's reach, she said. Tell them the situation. Tell them they need to decide. Not for us, not against the Empire, but for themselves. Tell them what's coming and let them choose. She paused. And tell them that Celine of the Ashen Frontier is asking, not the orphan, not the girl in gray. She felt the shadow fire rise at her hands without calling it. Tell them who's asking. Dort looked at her hands, at the darkness moving along her fingers in the cold frontier air, at the ruins around her and the volcanic stone beneath her, and the specific quality of authority that 6 weeks of earning had built into the way she occupied space. He straightened. Then he ran. Kaylor looked at her. 3 days, she said. 3 days? He confirmed. She breathed once, long and deliberate, and looked at the letter still in her hand. At the royal seal and the personal mark and the short, careful words of a man who had seen her on a ridge and said so in writing at the cost of something he couldn't get back. I saw you. She folded the letter, pressed it flat, and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had been surviving long enough to know the difference between the moment before everything changed and the moment everything had already changed. She understood that the review of the levy and the 3 days and the Morvain faction and the provincial garrison and everything that was about to move did not actually constitute the crisis she was preparing for. The crisis was already here. It had been here since the moment Darius Thorne sent a letter addressed to a title he had just acknowledged, because that acknowledgement had made the conflict inevitable in a way that the 6 weeks of frontier building had not. 6 weeks of building could be classified, by an empire good at classifying inconveniences, as civil disruption manageable through administrative pressure. A king writing to a title. That was recognition, and recognition of power outside the empire's structure was not something the empire's structure was built to survive. She put the letter inside her coat, against the place where the mate bond lived its persistent, complicated, irreversible life. Kaylor, she said. Yes. When the Duskwall garrison moves, she stopped. When they move, they're not coming for us. He went still. They're coming for the capital, she said, not to support Darius, to replace him. The silence that followed had a specific quality. The silence of a strategist recalculating an entire campaign map in real time because one piece of information has just revealed that the map was wrong. The Morvain alliance, Kaylor said slowly, was never about the match. No, Celine said. It was about access. Years of access. The revenue ministry, the provincial lords, the garrison commander. She looked at him. Seraphine Morvain has been building for longer than I have, and she has been building toward a throne. Kaylor looked at her with the expression of a man who had seen political coups in various forms across a 20-year career and was now watching one assemble itself in real time from a volcanic ruin on the Empire's forgotten frontier. If the garrison moves on the capital, he said, and Darius falls, then everything I've built out here becomes the only organized power structure outside the Morvain faction's reach, Celine said. And the frontier people who've been building with you become refugees in their own territory if Morvain consolidates. Yes. Celine. His voice was even, precise. This is no longer about the bond, or the banquet, or 14 years of invisibility. She looked at the ruins around her, at the wolf's head in basalt with its empty eye sockets that had felt her coming and responded. At the settlement behind her where 70 people were building something the Empire had not given them permission to build. At the letter against her chest. No, she said. It's not. The shadow fire rose along her arms without restraint. In the volcanic stone beneath her feet, the old inheritance of House Netheris ran its long, patient current through the bedrock of an empire that had believed itself to be the only power in the room. 3 days. And somewhere in Moonfang Palace, behind walls that still carried the murals of the Thorn dynasty's victories painted in blood pigment, A king who had just written "I Saw You" was about to discover that the faction he had been managing for political convenience had spent 2 years managing him instead. The riders went out before dawn, and Celine watched them leave from the settlement's eastern perimeter. 5 of Dort's fastest people disappearing into the basalt columns with word for every clan contact within a day's reach. She stood without moving until the last sound of hooves dissolved into the volcanic silence. And then she stood a little longer, because the silence after departure had its own information if you were willing to hold still long enough to receive it. She had not slept. This was not anxiety. She had stopped confusing heightened alertness with distress weeks ago. What she felt now was the open, architectural focus of someone whose mind was running at full capacity on a problem that required everything she had. 3 days, Kaylor had estimated. She had spent the night reconsidering that estimate. Seraphine Morvain was not a reactive strategist. Celine had watched her operate from palace corridors for 4 years, with sufficient proximity to understand the difference. Seraphine moved before variables confirmed, not after, because moving after confirmation meant your opponent carried the same information and the same timeline, which meant 3 days was generous, which meant she was probably already moving. Celine turned from the perimeter and walked back to where Kaylor was bent over the territorial map, weight on his knuckles, 2 frontier fighters standing across from him. She told him about the revised timeline without preamble. He straightened, looked at the map. Duskwall to the capital is 4 days for cavalry moving light. She won't move the full garrison, Celine said. She needs enough to control the palace, not hold the capital. Control the palace, control the communication infrastructure, control the official record. 200 riders, maybe less, if she has people already inside. Does she have people inside? She's had 3 years of access, Celine said. She has people inside. The silence between them had the specific weight of 2 people arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. Then Dort appeared at a run from the settlement's northern approach, and the timeline revised itself again, this time beyond calculation. His face told the content of his message before he spoke it. The specific expression of someone who has absorbed a catastrophic development and is delivering it with everything they have left after the absorption. Imperial cavalry hit Arath's eastern camp an hour ago, he said. 60 riders. Same unit markings as the Duskwall garrison. Celine went still. Not the settlement. Arath's camp. The clan contact network she had spent weeks building. The secondary structure that existed precisely as the fallback if the settlement was compromised. The Morvain faction had not targeted the obvious thing. They had targeted the redundancy, which meant they understood the architecture of what she had built, which meant they had been watching longer than 3 weeks of Border Clan reports. She split her force, Celine said. The words arrived in her mouth already assembled, the conclusion she had been building toward arriving fully formed. Capital and frontier simultaneously. She wasn't reacting to the letter. She had already decided. The letter triggered the timeline, not the decision. Kaylor looked at her with the expression he wore when a campaign map had just revealed itself to be wrong. She's been planning this since before you left the palace. Since before I left the palace, Celine confirmed. The levy, the clan intelligence, the timing of the recognition letter. She let me build here. She let the frontier structure develop until it was substantial enough to need eliminating, because a substantial threat justifies a substantial response. A woman in gray with no title doesn't require a legal framework. A woman with a title and a recognized frontier structure requires a legal operation, Kaylor said. One that looks like law enforcement rather than a coup. She's not just taking the throne, Celine said. She's doing it in a way that leaves no legal ground for challenge afterward. The 2 fighters on the other side of the map had the look of people recalibrating the scope of what they had agreed to. Celine registered this and made a decision she had been working toward since the silence after the riders left. Get the settlement's core people to the upper volcanic zone, she said to Dort. The old Nitharus survey tunnels. You know the ones. That's 3 days of supplies maximum, Dort said. Then I need to move in less than 3 days. She looked at Kaylor. I'm going south. He said nothing for a moment. Then, on 1 horse. Yes. Into a palace that may already be under Morvain control. Yes. This was the thing about decisions made at the intersection of the personal and the strategic. They could not be fully justified by either framework alone. Every strategic argument against going south was valid. The settlement needed its established leadership. The frontier structure was fragile at its edges. 6 weeks of Shadowfire training was not a military asset sufficient to alter the balance of a palace seizure. Every one of those arguments was correct, and none of them changed what she was going to do. Kaler. She held his gaze. If Morvain consolidates the capital and the frontier falls, the people here get classified as pacification targets, not rebel combatants, targets. There will be no negotiation and no legal framework protecting them because the legal framework will have been written by the faction that needs them eliminated to hold power cleanly. She paused. I'm not going south for him. I'm going because the only way the people here survive what's coming is if there's still a contest for what comes next. He looked at her for a long moment, the appraisal she had learned to recognize, not of what she knew, but of what she had become. Don't lose yourself on the way south, he said. He turned east into the tree line. She turned south and rode. She pushed the horse to the edge of sustainable and held it there for 4 days. The frontier road unrolled beneath them, and she ran available intelligence through every analytical framework she possessed, and the output was consistently the same. Too many unknowns for conventional planning. So she built decision architecture instead of a plan. For each probable condition she would encounter at the capital, she identified the first 2 choices she would need to make. Not a plan. Plans broke when conditions changed. A framework for deciding under pressure. On the morning of the 4th day, the silver spires of Moonfang Palace were visible above the outer city, and she pulled to a stop on the road's high point and looked at what the distance could tell her. It told her the city was waiting, not closed, not quiet. Waiting. The particular stillness of a population that had received information it did not know how to process yet. She had grown up inside those walls. She knew their silences. This one meant something had already happened, and the full weight of it had not yet arrived at street level. She moved off the main road. The outer city's lower districts had supply corridors connecting to the palace's eastern infrastructure, routes she knew with the completeness of 14 years of movement through them. She found the first one without difficulty and began the approach through the city's functional underside, the layer that kept the magnificent surface operational and was never seen by the people who lived on that surface. She was 3 blocks from the supply gate when a hand caught her arm. The blade was out before the conscious decision. The hand belonged to Sable. Mid-30s, forgettable face, minor intelligence operative during her 4 years in the palace. The kind of man who would eventually become significant if he survived long enough. He looked at the blade, then at her face, then at the shadow fire visible at her hands, because she had stopped containing it somewhere on the 3rd day of riding. He sent me, Sable said. No name needed. 3 days ago, before the Morvain cavalry moved. She kept the blade where it was. Status. Palace is under partial Morvain control. Eastern Wing and the council chambers. His voice was precise, the voice of someone delivering a briefing under conditions that did not permit imprecision. The King's Guard held the residential section, but they've been contained. Morvain's not pushing for a direct military resolution. She wants a legal position. She's working to get a formal council declaration of regency authority. On what grounds? Sable looked at her directly. The letter. She breathed. Of course. The letter addressed to Selene of the Ashen Frontier, a reigning monarch entering into acknowledged diplomatic communication with an entity outside imperial authority without council approval, an obscure legal provision designed 2 centuries ago for different circumstances, but precise enough to hold if the council decided to apply it, and the council was now operating under Morvain conditions. Where is he, she said. Residential section, 3rd floor, not injured. He's being managed under temporary security protocol. Sable paused. He knows the cavalry was sent to the frontier. He doesn't know the outcome. Morvain's assets locked the dispatch system. She lowered the blade. Darius knew she was in danger and could not reach anyone who could tell him what had happened, and he was sitting in controlled containment while the legal instrument of that containment was the letter he had written to acknowledge her, the letter she still carried against her chest. She means nothing, said in public and then used against him. I saw you, written in private and then used against him. Everything he had done, in both directions, had been weaponized. This was the particular efficiency of sophisticated power operating without constraint. It did not need its opponents to make mistakes. It needed only for its opponents to act, and it would find the weaponizable surface of any action, no matter how small. "The supply gate," she said. Sable looked at the shadow fire at her hands, at the woman who had left this palace 6 weeks ago in gray with a coin pouch and a knife, and returned as something the palace had no administrative category for. His expression moved through rapid recalibration. "Clear," he said. Morvain took the formal entries, didn't prioritize the supply infrastructure. "Because they don't know it matters," she said. "Because they don't know it exists," he said. "Not the way you do." This was the thing about invisibility that the visible people never understood. It was not a disadvantage survived despite. It was intelligence. 14 years of comprehensive, intimate, operationally specific knowledge of every route and rhythm and human habit in this building, gathered by a person that the building had never thought to protect itself from. You cannot defend against a threat you cannot see. And Moonfang Palace had never been able to see her. She followed Sable to the gate, passed through it. The palace closed around her with the specific weight of a place that had shaped her and that she had, in the process of surviving it, shaped back. The servant corridors were exactly as she remembered. The particular quality of the air, the underground heating mixing with the stone cold, and the smell of the kitchens 2 levels below, was so precisely recalled that the 6 weeks on the frontier compressed into a different order of experience, something that had happened to a version of herself she was still in the process of integrating. She moved without sound through the eastern residential approach. Sable had given her the position of the 2 Morvain-affiliated guards on the stairwell landing, placed there not to prevent exit, but to monitor and report, because Morvain wanted containment, not confrontation, and confrontation would crack the legal framework she was building. Celine reached the stairwell landing. The guards registered her presence approximately 2 seconds before the shadow fire made the point moot. Not violence, restraint, precise, overwhelming, the dark current moving from her hands and finding the specific pressure points of human consciousness that Kaylor had spent 2 weeks teaching her after she had asked, very specifically, whether the inheritance could be used to stop people without destroying them. It could. They would wake with headaches and no memory of the last 4 minutes. She went up the stairs. The 3rd-floor residential corridor was lit with the lower-intensity evening torches that the palace used after the administrative day ended, and it looked exactly as it had looked every time she had moved through it, carrying messages for 4 years. The familiarity of it was almost disorienting. The sense that the building itself had not registered that everything had changed. Buildings never did. The door to the king's residential chambers was closed. She did not knock. She opened it. Darius was standing at the window with his back to the room, looking out over the capital city in the particular posture of a man who had been standing in one place for a long time and had run out of productive things to do with his body while his mind continued working. He turned at the sound of the door. The expression on his face when he saw her went through 3 distinct phases in less than 2 seconds. The first was the sharp involuntary relief of someone who has been receiving bad intelligence about a person's safety and has been unable to act on it. The second was the assessment, the rapid, comprehensive evaluation of what she was, standing in his doorway, in frontier clothing with the shadow fire visible at her hands, and 6 weeks of becoming written into the way she occupied space. The third was something more complicated that did not complete itself before he spoke. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "The frontier settlement hit," she said. Morvain split her force. Simultaneous operation. She watched his jaw tighten. "Your intelligence network didn't catch the split because the people in your network who would have caught it were already working for her." He absorbed this with the stillness she recognized. Running at capacity. "How long?" he said. "She's been building for at least 3 years, possibly from the beginning of the Morvain Alliance discussions." She stepped into the room. "The letter was not the cause, Darius. It was the trigger. She needed a legal instrument, and you gave her one. But the infrastructure was already in place." He looked at her, at the shadow fire, at the woman who had been declared nothing in his throne room and had returned through his supply corridors while his court was occupied with managing his containment. "The council declaration," he said, "is probably 24 hours from completion," she said. "She needs 2 more houses to commit. She'll have them by morning if nothing changes the political calculation. And you're here to change the political calculation." She looked at him steadily. I'm here because the people I left on the frontier survive or don't survive based on what happens in this palace in the next 12 hours. I'm here because the Nitharus bloodline was erased by your father for exactly this reason, because it represented a power outside your dynasty's control, and that representation was intolerable to an empire that confused its own continuity with the well-being of the people it governed. She breathed. I'm here because Seraphine Morvain is not building an alternative to your empire. She's building a more efficient version of its worst qualities, and the people who will pay for that efficiency are the ones who are always paying. Darius held her gaze. Something in the room had changed when she entered it. The atmospheric quality of the space, which had been, she could see from the evidence of it, the controlled tension of a man being contained against his capacity and his will, had shifted toward something else. Something that was not resolution. Something earlier than resolution, and necessary before it could arrive. What do you need from me? He said. She had not expected the directness of it. She had prepared for negotiation, for the institutional reflexes of a king reasserting precedence, for some version of the conversation in which his acknowledgement arrived wrapped in conditions she would have to navigate. What she had not prepared for was a man who had spent 4 days locked in a room with nothing to do but think, asking her what she needed. She looked at him for a moment. Your voice, she said. The houses that haven't committed to Morvain yet. They're waiting because they're uncertain, not because they're decided. A direct communication from you before the morning session changes the political calculation. Not a command, a statement of where you stand and what you know about what Morvain has built. And after, he said. After is a different conversation, she said, one that requires you to be in a position to have it. She held his gaze. Can we focus on the next 12 hours? He looked at her for one more moment. At the shadow fire, at the frontier clothing and the blade at her hip, and the 14 years and the 6 weeks and all the distance between the girl in gray who had carried his messages and the woman standing in his doorway who had come back through his supply corridors to change the architecture of his crisis. Yes, he said. He moved toward the desk, and somewhere in the palace around them, in the eastern wing and the council chambers and the corridors that Celine knew better than anyone alive who had not been intended to know them, the next 12 hours began to take shape. The settlement would hold or it would not. The council would hold or it would not. But the thing that Seraphine Morvain had not calculated for, the thing that her 3 years of anticipatory intelligence had not included because it had not existed 3 years ago and could not have been predicted, was the specific combination of a king who had finally learned to ask what someone needed, and a woman who had learned, in volcanic ruins and exile, and the raw education of actual survival, exactly what she was worth. That combination was new, and new things, in old institutions, were the most dangerous variables of all. Darius wrote 3 letters in 11 minutes. Celine stood at the window while he worked, watching the capital city below hold its waiting posture, and she counted what she knew against what she needed, and found the gap between them narrower than it had been 4 days ago on the frontier road, and still wider than she could afford. 3 letters. One to Lord Casvin of the Northern House, who had not committed to the Morvain Declaration, and whose commitment would bring 2 smaller houses with him by loyalty of old debt. One to Commander Aldrich of the King's Guard, who was holding the residential section with contained discipline and needed authorization to stop containing and start moving. And one to the council secretary, not a noble, not a power broker, a functionary, whose official record-keeping function meant that a direct royal communication received before the morning session would have to be entered into the proceedings' official log, which meant Morvain could not begin the session without the record reflecting that the king had communicated his position under his own authority. Legal architecture against legal architecture. She had suggested the 3rd letter. Darius had already thought of it, which told her something useful about the version of him that 4 days of enforced stillness had produced. Pressure did something different to different people. It compressed some, reduced them to the smallest, most offended version of their character, the version that had survived previous threats and defaulted to those survival mechanisms, regardless of whether those mechanisms fit the current threat. And it clarified others, stripped away the institutional habits and the performed authority and the layers of role that accumulated around people who held power long enough, until what remained was the actual person underneath. She was not certain which version of Darius she had walked in on. She was becoming more certain with each letter. He sealed the 3rd and stood. Aldrich needs 20 minutes to position his people. Morvain has assets on the second-floor corridor, she said, between the stairwell and the council antechamber. 3, possibly 4. He looked at her. You know where. I know where they'll be, she said, because I know which positions cover the most ground with the fewest people, and Morvain thinks in efficient coverage. She held his gaze. I'll take the corridor. Aldrich takes the Eastern Council approach. You walk into that chamber on your own 2 feet before she calls the session to order. And if she's already called it, then we're late, and we improvise. She picked up the blade from the desk where she had set it while he wrote. But she won't call it early. Calling it early looks like panic. She needs it to look like due process. Darius looked at her for a moment. At the blade. At the shadow fire running low and continuous along her forearms. The banked version that had become her resting state without her fully deciding it would. Something moved through his expression that was not the assessment she was used to from him. More personal than that. More direct. You came back through the supply gate, he said. Yes. You knew the route. I've known every route in this building since I was 14, he breathed. Celine, not now, she said. Not harshly. The same way she had said it on the ridge, simply. Because whatever he was going to say, it belonged to a conversation that required conditions they did not currently have, and conditions were the one thing she had learned to respect above all else. Walk out of this room like a king, the rest waits. He straightened, and there it was. The thing she had watched rooms bend toward for 4 years. The quality that was not performance and not cruelty but something structural, something built through years of carrying weight that would have broken a different person. He pulled it on the way a fighter pulled on armor, not because it was comfortable but because it was necessary. And when he moved toward the door, he moved like the man who had led 7 military campaigns and 3 succession crises. Not the man who had been sitting in a contained room for 4 days watching his court dismantle itself around him. She went left. He went right. The second-floor corridor of Moonfang Palace ran 60 feet between the residential stairwell and the council antechamber, lined with the alternating stone pillars and wall-mounted torches that the palace used in its functional sections. Less elaborate than the banquet hall, more substantial than the servant corridors. Celine moved through it with the specific quality of presence she had spent 6 weeks learning to inhabit, the quality that was the opposite of her old invisibility. Not because she had abandoned the knowledge of how to be unseen, but because she had learned to choose. She was choosing visible. 2 of Morvain's assets registered her at the same moment, from positions at the corridor's midpoint and near the antechamber door. Not soldiers. Intelligence operatives in palace staff clothing, the particular choice of someone who wanted control points that did not look like control points. They had the compact alertness of trained people who had been told to monitor and report, not to engage. Told that before Celine had become something that required a different set of instructions. The one at the midpoint moved first. She gave him credit for speed. He was fast and he committed to the movement without the half-second hesitation that got people killed in close-quarters situations. And if she had been the woman who left this palace 6 weeks ago, he would have had a significant advantage. She was not that woman. The shadow fire came off her right hand and found him before he closed half the distance. The dark current moving with the precision Kaylor had drilled into her through 3 weeks of daily practice on the volcanic flats. Not a wave, not an explosion, a targeted application to the specific neurological threshold that separated consciousness from its absence. He dropped without sound. The one near the antechamber door made a different decision. He went for the door rather than for her, which was tactically intelligent. Raise the alarm, get Morvain's people inside mobilized, sacrifice the corridor to protect the objective. She caught him at 4 feet from the door. The shadow fire hit him harder than the first, because the distance required more force, and she had not fully calibrated for it, and he hit the stone floor with a sound that was louder than she wanted. She held still for 3 seconds, listening. From inside the antechamber, voices, the specific tonal quality of people who had heard something uncertain and were deciding how to respond to it. She had 3 seconds before they decided. She opened the antechamber door. The room held 4 people. 2 more operatives near the inner council chamber door. A ministry official at the record table with ink still wet on a document she did not have to read to identify. The council declaration, in its preparatory form, waiting for the morning session to make it official. And Seraphine Morvain, standing at the center of the room in the silver-gray silk she favored for formal occasions, her expression in this moment of Celine's entrance moving through surprise into something that was not fear. Seraphine Morvain did not fear easily. This was, Celine had always understood, both her greatest strength and the specific quality that made her genuinely dangerous. Fear was information. It told you what you were risking, and people who processed it properly used it to calibrate their behavior. People who didn't experience it properly could not calibrate for their own exposure. They built plans that assumed their own invulnerability, and those plans held until the moment they encountered the specific variable they had not assessed because they could not imagine it threatening them. Seraphine looked at Celine, at the shadow fire, at the corridor behind her where two of her people were not standing, and the recalibration happened visibly, moving through her face with the speed of an intelligent person updating a threat assessment in real time. "You came through the supply infrastructure," Seraphine said. Not a question, an acknowledgement. The particular acknowledgement of a strategist identifying the gap in their planning at the moment the gap announced itself. "You didn't account for the routes," Celine said, "because they weren't in any document you could access, and you couldn't access them because the people who used them weren't people the palace kept records on." Seraphine's chin lifted fractionally. 14 years of servant corridor intelligence. Her voice had the quality of someone finding, even in a bad moment, a kind of professional appreciation for the mechanism that had undone them. "I dismissed you." "Everyone did," Celine said. "That was the point." The two operatives near the inner door had not moved. They were waiting for Seraphine's signal, which told Celine something important. They were loyal to her personally, not to a protocol. Operatives loyal to protocol moved on threat contact. Operatives loyal to a person waited for that person to decide. It meant Seraphine still controlled the next 10 seconds. "The declaration isn't complete," Seraphine said. "Stopping it here doesn't resolve the houses that have already committed." "I know. And the Duskwall garrison is already deployed." She held Celine's gaze with the specific steadiness of someone who had not yet decided they had lost. "You can take this room. You cannot take 3 provincial houses and a deployed military unit with Shadowfire and a king who's been locked in a room for 4 days. "No," Celine agreed. "I can't." The agreement surprised her. Celine watched it land, the specific disruption of an expected refutation that did not arrive. "What I can do," Celine continued, "is make certain that everyone in this empire who has not committed to you yet understands exactly what your 3-year plan looked like from the inside. The levy, the ministry access, the garrison deployment timed to a legal mechanism built on a letter you allowed to be sent because you needed the instrument." She paused. "You are a brilliant strategist, Seraphine. And you built this on the assumption that the people you were outmaneuvering would never have access to a comprehensive account of how you did it." Seraphine went very still. "I have been in this palace for 14 years, Celine said. "I know who talked to whom and when, and what was decided in which corridor, and who carried the decisions to which ministry. I know the shape of what you built because I was in the walls while you were building it, and I was invisible, and you never once considered that the invisible people might be paying attention." She held the other woman's gaze. "Call off the session. Recall the garrison. And I will not spend the next year dismantling your family's political position brick by brick using information that is already in my memory." The room held its position. This was the architecture of genuine standoffs. Not the dramatic ones where two people faced each other with weapons and physics would resolve the question, but the real ones, where two people faced each other with information and the question was which person's version of the future the other people in the room would choose to believe in. Seraphine Morvan looked at Celine Versa, the orphan, the girl in gray, the rejected mate, the frontier insurgent, the last heir of a bloodline her own political alliance had benefited from the erasure of, and performed the final calculation. Then the inner council chamber door opened from the other side. Darius Thorne walked through it, not from the residential section via the stairwell, from inside the council chamber itself, which meant Aldrich had moved faster than 20 minutes and had found an approach that Morvain's people on the corridor had not been covering because no one had expected the king to come from inside the room they were protecting access to. He stopped when he saw the configuration of the antechamber, took it in with the 2-second comprehensive read of a man who had survived 7 campaigns, by never letting the difference between what he expected and what he found cost him more than 2 seconds. His eyes found Celine, then Seraphine, then the document on the record table. He walked to the table, picked up the document, and looked at it with the expression of a man reading the specific legal language that had been constructed to dismantle his authority, and finding, in the reading of it, something that was less like fury and more like the cold, clean clarity of a person who has just seen the exact shape of a betrayal and is deciding what to do with the sight of it. He set the document down. "Seraphine, miss," he said. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, not quite the fear she didn't experience easily, but adjacent to it. The specific quality of someone who has built a plan around a person's predictable behavior and is now confronting the version of that person that the plan did not account for. "This is over," he said. The words had no performance in them, no throne room resonance, no deployed authority. The flat, certain statement of a man who meant what he was saying and did not need anyone in the room to believe it before it was true. "The garrison recall goes out under my seal in the next 10 minutes. The houses that committed to the declaration will receive a communication from me that gives them a clean way to uncommit without losing face, because I am not interested in punishing people for being outmaneuvered by the same strategy that outmaneuvered me." He paused. "What happens to you is a different question, one that gets answered in the morning when the council sits and has all the information it needs to sit with." Seraphine looked at him, then at Celine, then at the document on the table. The calculation behind her eyes was visible and rapid and arrived at its conclusion in less time than it took to draw a full breath. The specific conclusion of an intelligence that had, for the first time in 3 years, encountered conditions it had not designed for. "You'll want the names of the ministry officials," she said. Her voice was precise, controlled, the voice of someone who had identified in the rubble of one plan the foundations of the next negotiation. "The ones who are mine, not yours. You'll want them identified before the morning session, not after." Darius looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Then we should talk," she said, "before the morning." This was the nature of sophisticated power in its most distilled form. Even in defeat, it negotiated. Even at the moment of collapse, it found the leverage available in the rubble and used it. Not because it was shameless, but because it understood, at a level below conscious decision, that power was not a state you held. It was a practice you maintained, and the maintenance did not stop because the current configuration had failed. Celine watched this exchange and felt something complex and specific. Not admiration, not contempt. The recognition of a quality in another person that you understood because you shared the architecture of it, even if you had built very different structures on that architecture. Seraphine Morvain had spent 3 years preparing for every variable she could identify. She had not been able to identify the one that mattered, because the one that mattered had spent 14 years being invisible in the walls of the building where the plan was assembled. Darius looked at Celine across the antechamber. The shadow fire was still at her hands, low and present, the resting state it had become. In the torchlight of the palace room, it looked like what it was: ancient, inherited, patient. The darkness that had survived a purge by hiding inside the palace that ordered it, waiting to be called by its correct name. He crossed the room to her. Not with the throne room movement, not with the campaign commander movement. Something else. The movement of a man who had made a decision he was not going to qualify. He stopped at 2 feet. Close enough that the mate bond, which had persisted through everything with the indifference of something that did not take instructions from human decisions, registered the proximity with a force that she felt in her sternum and did not attempt to override. "I need you to know something," he said. His voice was the private version, the one she had heard exactly once before, in the sentence that had cost him something, in the letter against her chest. "Darius, let me say it." He held her gaze. "Not as the king, not as the man who owes you an accounting for what happened in that banquet hall, which I do, and which we will have in full when there is time to have it properly." He breathed once. "What I need you to know right now, in this room, is that when I sent that letter, when I wrote I saw you, I meant it as the most honest thing I have said from a position of power in 10 years of holding it. And I need you to know it because in the next 12 hours there are going to be moments where you need to decide whether to trust my judgment, and that decision is yours to make. But I want you to make it with that information." She looked at him, at the scar from ear to chin and the war-pelt travel clothing and the 4 days of enforced stillness that had produced a version of him she was still calibrating for. "I know," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "You know." "I've been reading you for 4 years," she said, "and the letter was the first time you gave me something accurate to read." She held his gaze steadily. "That's not nothing." Something shifted in his expression. Behind them, Seraphine Morvain was being escorted by 2 of Aldrich's King's Guard through the inner chamber door. The ministry official at the record table had stopped looking at the declaration document and started looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who was revising their recent employment decisions. The council chamber beyond the antechamber was filling with the sound of Aldrich's people taking up the positions that had been occupied by Morvain's assets, the particular organized movement of disciplined soldiers reclaiming familiar ground. The palace was not secured. 3 provincial houses were still committed to a declaration that no longer had a functional mechanism behind it. The Duskwall garrison recall would take hours to confirm. The morning council session would be the most politically volatile gathering in Moonfang Palace in a decade, and the outcome of it depended on variables that neither Celine nor Darius could fully control. And the Ashen Frontier, Dort, Cress, Wick, the 70 people in the survey tunnels of the volcanic zone, was still sitting in the gap between what Celine had managed to build and what had been taken from them. And that gap would not close until the political architecture of the capital resolved itself into something that could extend protection rather than threat to people who had been surviving without either for too long. None of it was finished. None of it was clean. This was the reality of actual power and actual conflict. It did not end at a moment. It evolved through moments, each one contingent on the last, none of them providing the finality that the shape of the conflict seemed to promise. The banquet hall was not the end. The frontier was not the end. The antechamber was not the end. What the antechamber had done was shift the weight. And weight, shifted in the right direction at the right moment, was the closest thing to resolution that most situations ever offered. Celine turned toward the inner chamber door. "The morning session," she said. "Tell me which houses are weakest in their commitment." Darius moved to her left. The position he took without appearing to choose it, 2 feet, matching her pace, the specific spatial relationship of 2 people who had stopped negotiating their proximity and started simply occupying it. "Casvin will fold the moment you walk into the room," he said, "because of the bloodline. Because of the shadow fire," he said. Casvin is old enough to remember what the purge was actually about. Walking in with the Nithrius inheritance active and standing next to the king is a political statement that requires no words. She considered this. And the other 2. Henvar needs a guarantee that his Eastern trade contracts survive the transition. He committed to Morvan for economic reasons, not ideological ones. And the 3rd, a pause. Brief, but she caught it. "The 3rd, Darius said, is more complicated." She looked at him. "Because the 3rd, he said, is Lord Morvain, Seraphine's father, who has been operating under the belief that his daughter's plan was containable if it failed, because I would not move against a major house on the basis of his daughter's ambition alone." He met her gaze. "He was correct about that when I was operating alone." She understood what he was saying. He was not operating alone. And the calculation that Lord Morvain had built his commitment on, the calculation that accounted for a king constrained by political necessity, did not account for a woman who had 14 years of palace intelligence and 6 weeks of frontier infrastructure and an inheritance that the empire had committed genocide to erase. Standing in the council chamber at dawn with nothing left to lose and no institutional constraint on what she was willing to say out loud. The morning session was 4 hours away. The palace settled into its new configuration around them, Aldrich's people moving through the corridors with the efficiency of soldiers given clear authorization after days of unclear orders, the specific organizational relief of a structure that had been held in suspension and was now allowed to function. Celine walked through the inner chamber door with the shadow fire at her hands and the letter still against her chest, and 14 years of invisible knowledge at her back. And the council chamber of Moonfang Palace opened around her in all its obsidian and blood pigment magnificence. And she stood in the center of it and looked at the long table and the empty seats that would fill in 4 hours with the people who would decide what the empire became next. She had come back through the supply gate, She had come back through invisibility, through the routes no one had thought to guard because no one had thought they mattered, through the 14-year education in how power actually moved through a building rather than how it officially claimed to move. And now she was standing in the center of the room that the Empire considered its highest point, and the shadow fire ran along her arms in the torchlight, and the mate bond hummed in the space between her and the man who had just walked in behind her, and 4 hours stood between this moment and the one that would determine whether everything she had built and lost and fought for in the last 6 weeks had been enough. She looked at the obsidian table, at the seats, at the Empire that did not know yet what it was about to become. 4 hours. She had survived worse odds on less sleep with fewer allies and a thinner understanding of what she was carrying. She breathed, and the shadow fire rose to meet the breath, steady and ancient and entirely, structurally hers. The council session began at dawn with 11 lords in their seats and 2 empty chairs. The empty chairs belonged to houses that had committed to the Morvain Declaration and had, in the 4 hours between the antechamber and the morning session, received Darius's communication and chosen not to appear rather than appear without a clear position. Lord Casvin sat in his chair with the specific stillness of a man who had spent the pre-dawn hours revising his political commitments and was still processing the cost of that revision. Lord Henvar sat 3 seats down with his hands flat on the obsidian table and his eyes on the door, waiting for the guarantee about the Eastern trade contracts that Darius had arranged to be delivered in writing before the session opened. And Lord Aldrich Morvain, Seraphine's father, the third and most complicated commitment, the man who had built his calculation on the assumption that a king constrained by political necessity would not move against him, sat at the table's far end and looked at Celine with an expression she had never seen directed at her from a man of his standing before. Not dismissal, not contempt. The expression of someone reassessing the foundations of a plan that had seemed structurally sound until the moment it revealed its missing element. Celine stood at the chamber's eastern wall, not seated, not at the table. She had chosen the standing position deliberately, not the position of someone presenting a case, not the position of someone waiting for judgment, but the position of someone present on their own terms in a room where the terms were still being decided. The shadow fire was banked, barely visible, a faint trace at her fingertips that she had chosen not to conceal and not to display. It simply was, the way she simply was, in this room that had never had a category for her. Darius opened the session without ceremony. This was characteristic of him in situations where ceremony would function as delay. He understood, with the tactical precision of a man who had managed succession crises before, that the longer a contested room had to breathe, the more opportunity it generated for people to reassemble their positions into configurations that required additional negotiation. He moved through the formal opening language in 40 seconds and went directly to the matter. "You've all received my communication," he said. "You've all seen the garrison recall, and you've all had 4 hours to process the information about the mechanism that was used to generate the declaration you were asked to commit to." He looked at each face in sequence, the specific comprehensive attention of a man who had learned to read rooms by reading people. "I'm not here to prosecute this morning. I'm here to tell you what I intend and ask whether you're willing to be part of it." Lord Casvin spoke first, old enough to remember the Netheris Purge, old enough to look at Celine against the eastern wall and understand exactly what the shadow fire at her hands represented in the architecture of imperial bloodline politics. "What you intend," he said. His voice had the careful quality of a man choosing each word with awareness of how it would be recorded. "That requires some definition, Your Majesty." "It does," Darius said, "and I'll give it." He paused, not for effect, with the deliberate quality of a man who had spent 4 days in a room thinking about what he was going to say if he got the chance to say it. "This empire has been governed on the assumption that the continuity of its structure is equivalent to the well-being of its people. That assumption is wrong. I have governed on it. Many of you have governed on it. The Morvain faction built their plan on exploiting the gap between what that assumption promises and what it delivers, and they found the gap wide enough to build an entire alternative power structure inside it without anyone noticing for 3 years. The room was very quiet. "That gap is the problem," Darius said, "not the faction. The faction is a symptom. The gap is the disease." Lord Morvain's hands moved slightly on the table. A small adjustment. The specific movement of a man whose argument has just been removed from under him by someone who identified the foundation of the argument rather than its surface. Because Seraphine Moore Vane had built her justification on exactly that gap, on the genuine grievances of provincial houses and frontier people and merchant structures that felt unheard and undertaxed for their contribution and over-extracted for their compliance. She had been right about the gap. She had simply intended to exploit it rather than close it. And her father, sitting at the table's far end, had committed to her plan not because he believed the empire needed replacing, but because he believed the empire needed a different management structure, one more favorable to the houses that held the eastern provinces together. He had not been wrong about the need. He had been wrong about the method, and wrong about the variable he had failed to account for, the variable standing at the eastern wall with an inheritance that predated the current dynasty and knowledge of the palace's institutional interior that no document in the empire's administrative history contained. Celine spoke once during the formal session. Once was enough. She waited until Lord Morvain had completed his statement, careful, precise, the statement of a man who understood that the morning's outcome was no longer about the declaration, but about the terms on which he remained a functional member of the Imperial Council. And then she spoke from the eastern wall in the even, unhurried voice she had developed over 14 years of being heard only when she made being heard inevitable. The eastern provincial contracts, she said, the ones that Henvar committed to the declaration to protect, the ones that 3 other houses have been managing their political alignments around for 2 cycles. She looked at Darius, not at Henvar, not at the council, at Darius. Because what she was about to say required him to confirm it in real time, and the confirmation needed to be visible. The current structure routes 20% of the Eastern trade revenue through ministerial channels that add no administrative value and exist primarily to provide leverage over the houses that depend on the contracts. That 20%, redistributed directly to the provincial house management structures, covers the grievance that generated the Eastern Coalition commitment to the Morvain Alliance without requiring any house to choose between their economic survival and their political loyalty. Henvar looked at her, then at Darius. Darius said, "Yes." One word, the same word he had said in the residential section when she asked what he needed from her. The same word, carrying the same weight. The weight of a man who had decided to stop performing certainty and start practicing it. Henvar exhaled. The specific exhale of a man whose primary anxiety has just been addressed and who is now free to make the decision his loyalty had been trying to make for 3 days. The session concluded in 2 hours. Not with unanimity. Lord Morvain's position remained the subject of a separate proceeding, and the 2 absent houses required individual communication before their status was resolved. But the declaration was formally withdrawn from the record. The ministry officials identified by Seraphine as her assets were placed under administrative suspension pending review, and the garrison recall was confirmed in writing with the signature of 3 council witnesses. It was not clean. It was never going to be clean. Real resolutions were not clean. They were negotiated, contingent, partial, the product of competing interests finding the specific overlap where cooperation was more useful than conflict. Not because anyone had transcended their interests, but because the landscape of available action had been altered enough that cooperation had become the rational choice. Understanding this was not cynicism. It was the difference between expecting institutions to be transformed by individuals and understanding that institutions were changed by changing the conditions inside which individuals made their decisions. Celine understood this. She had understood it from 14 years of watching the palace's official version of itself diverge from its operational reality, and from 6 weeks of building something on the frontier that worked. Not because people had stopped being people, but because the conditions she had created made the things she needed from people align with the things they needed for themselves. She left the council chamber when the session concluded and went to find a room with a window and an hour of silence. Because she had been running at full capacity for 4 days, and the human body, even one carrying an inheritance that pressed against its limits, had requirements that could not be indefinitely deferred. She found a small room in the residential wing's eastern section, one she had used before for exactly this purpose, in the 4 years before everything changed. A room with a narrow window that looked east over the lower city, and a stone bench under the window and no official function, which meant no one came to it for official reasons. She sat on the bench. She looked out the window. The capital city below was moving through its mourning, the waiting posture of yesterday replaced by the specific quality of a population that had received enough information to resume forward motion without yet having enough to be certain of the direction. Merchants were opening. The market district was generating its characteristic noise. Children were in the lower streets doing what children did in cities that were not actively burning. She pressed the back of her skull against the stone wall behind her. The mate bond was very present in the quiet. It had the quality it always had when Darius was in the same building, the specific low hum of proximity, the sense of the architecture of the world having organized itself in a way that the bond considered correct. She had stopped fighting this the way she had stopped fighting the shadow fire. Not surrender, recognition. The bond was not an obligation. It was a fact. And facts, she had learned, were most dangerous when you spent your energy pretending they were something else. She was still there when the door opened. Darius came in the way he had come through the residential chamber door 4 days ago, without announcement, with awareness of the intrusion, adjusting his presence in the room to take up less space than his size technically required. He looked at her on the bench, at the window, at the 4 days and the 6 weeks and the entire span of everything they had moved through written in the quality of her stillness. He sat on the floor with his back against the opposite wall. Not the bench. The floor. The specific choice of someone who was not trying to manage a conversation from a position of relative height or authority, who was simply occupying the room at the level it offered and letting that be what it was. They sat in silence for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. It had the quality that silence between two people had when neither of them was performing ease and neither of them was performing tension, when the silence was simply the actual state of the moment, requiring nothing added to it. "The frontier people," she said finally. "Aldrich is leading a supply convoy north this afternoon," he said. "Kingsguard escort. Not an occupation, a supply run. Whatever happened to the settlement, the people in it need resources before they need policy." She nodded. "The survey tunnels," she said. "Dort will know to watch for the convoy's approach. Tell Aldrich to send one rider ahead with identification, so Dort doesn't interpret a column of Kingsguard as a second attack." "I'll tell him." Silence. The city noise came through the window in the way city noise always came through windows. Filtered, distant, the texture of collective life reduced to ambient sound. "Kaylor Vane," she said. "Pardoned," Darius said. "Already drafted. He'll receive it by courier within the week." A pause. "The pardon doesn't cover the original charge. It supersedes it on the grounds that the intelligence that generated the charge was manufactured by the same ministry faction that built the Morvain operation." She looked at him. "You knew that." "I found it this morning," he said, "in the documentation Seraphine provided during the pre-dawn negotiation." His jaw tightened slightly. Kaylor Vane was exiled because he identified the ministry irregularities that the Morvain faction needed to maintain. They manufactured a charge against him, and I signed the exile order without adequate review of the underlying intelligence. He held her gaze. "That is mine to own." She looked at him for a moment. At the scar from ear to chin and the exhaustion that 4 days of containment and 1 night of crisis had produced in the set of his face, and beneath the exhaustion something that she had been watching develop since the ridge, and that had arrived in the last 12 hours at something close to its completed form. Accountability without performance. This was rarer in people with significant power than the outside observation of power ever suggested. Power provided infinite mechanisms for the appearance of accountability. Public acknowledgement, formal apology, the institutional ceremony of admitting error. What it rarely provided was the actual internal experience of accountability, the genuine reckoning with the gap between what you decided and what you should have decided without the buffer of someone else's fault to absorb the gap. She had watched Darius move toward this over the course of part 4 of his life, beginning somewhere in the 4 days of a locked residential room and arriving in this small room with its narrow window, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, saying, "That is mine to own," with the specific flatness of a man who had stopped needing the sentence to be more complicated than it was. "The banquet hall," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for an apology," she said. "I want to tell you something about it," she breathed. "What you did in that hall, the specific cruelty of the public declaration. I have thought about it a great deal in 6 weeks, and I have arrived at a position that surprised me." She paused. I am grateful for it. His expression shifted. Not because it didn't hurt, she said. It did. In ways, I spent the first week on the frontier trying to catalog and gave up cataloging because the catalog was too long. She looked at him steadily. I'm grateful because it removed the last barrier. I had spent 18 months telling myself I was being patient and strategic and careful, and all of it was true. And all of it was also a way of remaining in a position where I could still be chosen, still be recognized, still be made legitimate by someone else's decision. She breathed. You made that impossible. And in making it impossible, you made something else possible. I had to go find out what I was when the option of being chosen was gone. He held her gaze without speaking. I found out, she said. Something moved through his expression that she had no catalog entry for, and was not going to try to name, because some things were more accurately held than described. Celine, he said. The bond, she said. I know it's still there. I know you know it's still there. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, and I'm not going to pretend that what I said on the ridge, not yet, the right to this conversation has to be earned. I'm not going to pretend that was permanent. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand what earning it means. It does not mean returning to what we were before the banquet, because what we were before the banquet was me surviving in the margins of your life, and you correcting your attention away from something the bond was telling you about. That version of us doesn't exist anymore. If anything exists, it's something that gets built, he said, not recovered. She looked at him. I understand that, he said. I want to be clear that I understand it, not as a concession, as the thing I actually want. He met her gaze with the directness she had been watching him develop since he sat on the floor instead of the bench. I spent 4 days in that room thinking about what I had built. The empire, the alliances, the specific version of authority I had cultivated over 10 years of holding power, and I kept arriving at the same question. He paused. Who was it for? She waited. The campaigns were for the empire, he said. The succession management was for the empire. Every calculation I made about political alliances and blood tax structures and provincial relationships, all of it was for the empire. And somewhere in those 4 days, I understood that I had conflated the empire's continuity with my own and called that governance. And the person who paid the most immediate price for that conflation was standing 12 feet from me in a banquet hall being declared nothing, while I told myself I was making a necessary decision. He breathed. I was not making a necessary decision. I was protecting a story I had built about myself from a truth that required me to be someone larger than the story. The city noise came through the window. The mate bond hummed. Celine held the weight of what he had just said with the seriousness it deserved, which meant holding it without immediately responding, because the reflex to respond quickly to significant statements was a way of controlling them, of managing them into a form that was less challenging to sit with. She let it sit. Then, the frontier people need representation in the council structure, she said. He looked at her. The shift was not jarring. This was one of the things she had understood about him since the ridge, that he could move between the personal and the political without losing the thread of either, not because they were separate, but because he had finally, in the last 12 hours, stopped treating them as separate. Define representation. A frontier council seat, not advisory, voting, rotating among the clan leaders who have been managing those territories without imperial support for 2 generations. She held his gaze. They know those territories better than anyone in this chamber. Their knowledge should have structural authority, not just courtesy access. The established houses will resist. The established houses just spent 3 years being outmaneuvered by a faction that understood the frontier better than they did, she said. They may be more receptive to structural reform than they would have been a week ago. He was quiet for a moment. The calculation visible, efficient, moving through the implications with the speed she had always associated with him, and now could watch without the old practice of pretending she wasn't watching. It would need to be phased. 1 seat initially, with a formal review after 2 years. 1 seat is enough to begin, she said. And the Nithris recognition, he said. Not a question. He had been building toward it since the antechamber and was arriving at it now with the directness of someone who had decided to stop approaching things sideways. Your bloodline, the formal acknowledgement of what the purge was and what it erased. She breathed. This was the thing she had not allowed herself to want, for reasons that had been survival and had calcified into something she no longer needed. The acknowledgement that the erasure had happened, that a bloodline had been destroyed for the specific crime of representing a power that the dynasty found intolerable, that the orphan in gray had not been an accident of misfortune, but the result of a deliberate act of political violence committed by the institution she had spent 14 years serving in the margins of. Yes, she said, not for the title, for the record. For the record, he confirmed. The official record of Moonfang Palace, which would now contain the account of what the Morvain faction had built and how it had been dismantled, would also contain the formal acknowledgement of House Nithris. The two documents would sit in the same archive. Future people, reading the history of this empire, would have access to both. History was not justice, but history that told the truth was the precondition of justice, and preconditions mattered. She looked at her hands. The shadow fire was barely visible now, the lowest presence it maintained, the resting state that had become as natural as breathing, the inheritance of a house that had been erased and had survived in the body of a woman who had been declared nothing and had gone to find out what she was when that declaration was all she had. She knew what she was now. That knowledge was not contingent on anyone else's acknowledgement. It did not require a council vote or a formal record entry or the bond that hummed in her chest with its ancient, persistent indifference to political decisions. It had been established in the volcanic ruins of the Ashen Frontier when a woman who had walked away from a palace rather than beg to remain in it discovered that the walking away was not the loss the palace had believed it was. It was the beginning. "There's something I want to ask you," Darius said. She looked at him. "The frontier," he said. "You're going back." Not a question. He had understood this. She was not sure when. Possibly on the ridge, possibly in the antechamber, possibly in the 4 days of the locked room when he had been thinking about everything he had built and who it was for. He had understood that the woman who came back through the supply gate had not come back to take a position inside the institution she had come back to correct. "I'm going back," she said. "The council seat," he said. "The frontier representation. Who holds it?" She looked at him. "The clan leaders, rotating. As I said. And you." She held his gaze. "You are the last heir of House Nithris," he said. "The acknowledgement we're putting in the record restores that standing. In the formal structure of the empire, that makes you—" "I know what it makes me," she said. "In the formal structure." "And outside the formal structure?" She breathed. Outside the formal structure, she was the woman who had spent 6 weeks in volcanic ruins, learning to call an inheritance by its correct name, who had organized 70 people into a structure that functioned not because she commanded it, but because she had created conditions in which the people in it could function like themselves, who had come back to the palace not as a claimant or a conqueror, but as someone who understood that the building had a gap in its foundations large enough to swallow everything good it might have been, and who had the specific knowledge to identify the gap and the specific authority, not institutional, earned, to say so out loud in a room full of people who had been pretending the gap was not there. "Outside the formal structure," she said, "I am whoever I decide to be. That is the first thing I learned on the frontier and the last thing I'll surrender." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen in 4 years of watching him, and 6 weeks of not watching him, and 4 days of watching him again from close range. He smiled. Not the controlled expression of a king acknowledging a point well made. Not the professional recognition of someone who had just heard an argument they found persuasive. The actual thing. Brief, unguarded, the smile of a man who has just been surprised by something in the best possible way and whose face has briefly stopped managing itself. "That's going to complicate the formal structure considerably," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The smile settled into something quieter and more durable, the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not planned to arrive and found, against his expectations, that it was exactly where he needed to be. 3 weeks later, Selene stood at the edge of the Ashen Frontier where the provincial road met the basalt columns, With the volcanic sky above her and the smell of sulfur in the air and the specific quality of light that the frontier carried even in the early spring, when warmth was still more promise than delivery. Behind her, the settlement was rebuilt, not fully. Not in the 3 weeks since Aldrich's supply convoy had arrived to find Dort leading 70 people out of the survey tunnels with the particular dignity of people who had survived a deliberate attempt at their elimination and had not yet been given the time to be angry about it, because survival required all available attention and anger had been deferred to a later date. But the basic structure was standing. The eastern perimeter was functional. The council meeting space that had previously been 3 fire circles and the ground between them now had a roof. Cress was alive. 3 cracked ribs and a head wound that had kept her horizontal for a week and been the subject of considerable profanity from a woman who had a great deal of work to do and did not appreciate being kept from it. Wick was alive. Dort was alive. The wolf's head in black basalt, with its empty eye sockets, was still standing in the ruins exactly where it had been standing for 2 generations of Empire, and before that for however long House Nithris had stood. She had touched it on her first day, and it had responded. She touched it now and felt the same thing, the pressure of recognition, the deep current of something that understood itself to be at home. Kaler Vane had returned the day before, arrived without announcement in the way he always arrived, from the eastern tree line, without ceremony, and stood at the settlement's perimeter until Celine came to meet him. They had looked at each other for a moment, and she had said well, and he had said well, and that had been the reunion, which was exactly right for both of them. He was sitting near the ruins now, talking with 2 of the newer clan representatives who had come for the first formal Frontier Council meeting scheduled for the following morning. The meeting that would select the rotating representative for the council seat that was now, by formal Imperial Council record, a structural feature of Veilor's governance. The Empire had not transformed. She had never expected it to transform. Transformation was the language of people who needed their efforts to produce dramatic and total change, or they couldn't justify the effort. What she had expected, what she had worked toward with the specific pragmatism of someone who had spent 14 years watching an institution from the inside, was alteration. The introduction of new structural elements that changed the conditions in which decisions were made, without requiring any individual inside the institution to become a different kind of person. Better conditions produce better decisions from the same people. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough to matter. The Frontier Council seat was a new structural element. The Nithris acknowledgement was a new structural element. The ministerial review that was now under the oversight of a council subcommittee that included 2 frontier representatives systematically examining the blood tax structures and provincial extraction mechanisms that had been generating the gap between the Empire's official purpose and its operational reality. That was a new structural element. None of it was finished. All of it had begun. She had received a communication from Darius that morning, not an official dispatch, a letter, sealed with the royal mark rather than the imperial one, the personal authority rather than the institutional. She had read it twice and then folded it with the same care she had given the first one and put it with the first one in the interior pocket of her coat. The letter said, "The council session went long." Casvin tried to add 18 provisos to the blood tax review mandate. Aldrich took Casvin's side on 11 of them and then reversed on 8 when I pointed out that the 11 he had agreed to would cost his own house money in the medium term. I am finding that governance is considerably more interesting when I stop treating it as a problem of management and start treating it as a problem of design. I believe you knew that already. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I learned it from watching what you built here. And then at the end, in the same handwriting but with a different quality, the quality of a man who had stopped performing even for himself. I would like to come to the frontier. Not officially. When the timing makes sense, if that is something you would consider. She had not yet replied. She would. The timing was its own answer. The specific timing of 2 people who had been circling each other for 4 years and 6 weeks in a crisis, who had stood on a ridge and in an antechamber and on a floor opposite a stone bench, and who had arrived, through all of it, at a version of themselves that was large enough to hold what they were to each other without requiring it to be smaller or simpler than it was. The bond would not resolve the gap between them. The gap required the same thing every real gap required. the willingness to cross it without guarantees, to build something in the crossing rather than waiting for the crossing to be safe. She had not survived the last 6 weeks by waiting for safety. The frontier wind came across the basalt columns from the north, carrying the specific combination of cold and sulfur and old stone that she had come to associate not with hardship, but with the particular quality of a place that demanded authenticity in exchange for shelter. The ashen frontier did not accommodate pretense. It was too old and too indifferent and too honest in its geology for pretense to hold against it. She breathed it in. The shadow fire moved along her hands with the steady, unhurried certainty of something that had arrived at its correct relationship with the person who carried it. Not a weapon, not a performance, an inheritance. The accumulated truth of a bloodline that had been declared erased and had refused the declaration, not through dramatic defiance, but through the patient, unglamorous daily work of continuing to exist. She thought of the girl who had walked out of Moonfang Palace 6 weeks ago in a gray cloak with a coin pouch and a knife and 60 seconds of grief against a cold stone wall. She did not mourn her. She did not need to anymore. Because the girl in gray had been right about the most important thing, even before she had the language or the power or the frontier ruins to confirm it. She had walked away when staying would have required her to accept a definition of herself written by someone else. She had refused the definition without knowing yet what the correct definition was, trusting only that whatever she was, it was more than the word nothing. She had been right. This was the thing that the architecture of power rarely accounted for, and the people who survived it always understood. The bravest decision was not the one made with the most information or the most resources or the most certainty of outcome. The bravest decision was the one made from a cold corridor with 60 seconds of grief and no guarantee of anything waiting on the other side of the palace gate except the cold itself. And what had been waiting on the other side of the gate was not safety or justice or the dramatic vindication that made stories feel complete. What had been waiting was the opportunity to find out who she was when no one was deciding for her. She had found out. She stood at the edge of the ashen frontier with the shadow fire at her hands and the 2 letters against her chest and the settlement at her back. And she looked out at the volcanic landscape of her family's old territory and felt the specific quality of someone who has arrived somewhere. It took everything they had to reach. And who knows, in the particular way that genuine arrival announces itself, that this is not the end of anything. It is the first morning of what comes next. The Empire did not sleep. But Valor was learning, slowly and imperfectly and at the cost of everything it took to teach it, that the alternative to sleeping was not the same as the alternative to rest. It was learning to breathe. And from the eastern ruins of House Netheris, in the basalt Wolf's Head, with its empty eye sockets and its deep stone patience, something that had been waiting 2 generations for the correct person to carry it home, settled into its proper position in the architecture of the world. Not a weapon, not a throne, an inheritance, finally and fully claimed, by a woman who had been declared nothing, and had decided, in the quiet of a cold corridor, to find out what that meant on her own terms. The wind came across the frontier. The shadow fire answered it. And in Valor, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not fear and was not force, but was the older, stranger, more demanding thing that lived beneath both of them. Something that looked, if you were willing to look directly at it, like the beginning of something worth building, began quietly to take hold.